I am Douglas, and I am 66 years old. I spent 4 decades managing commercial freight operations, a career built on anticipating disasters, mitigating risks, and dealing with people who constantly tried to rewrite the terms of a contract. When I finally retired, I purchased a property on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. It was fully paid off, surrounded by quiet water and old trees, a sanctuary designed for absolute silence. I was kneeling on the wooden planks of my private dock, the smell of salt water and fresh cedar stain heavy in the air, when my phone vibrated against the wood. It was Travis, the man my daughter Megan had married. Travis never called to check on my health or ask about my day. When I answered, he did not offer a greeting. Over the loud clattering noise of a busy restaurant in his background, he barked an order. "Gary and Linda lost their lease," he said, referring to his parents. "They are moving into your guest wing on Tuesday. Megan says you have plenty of room. Deal with it." I held the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second, analyzing the sheer arrogance of his demand. I did not yell. I did not argue the logistics of his parents moving into my home without permission. Decades of dealing with hostile negotiations taught me that showing anger only gives the adversary a target to attack. I simply told him the gate code was unchanged, and I ended the call. The swift capitulation on my end was tactical. It would make Travis overconfident, blinding him to my immediate mobilization. I wiped the cedar stain from my hands with a rag, walked straight up the gravel path to my house, and completely bypassed the guest rooms. I drove to the local supply store, purchased heavy-duty commercial deadbolts, and spent the remainder of the afternoon installing them on my master suite and my home office. Inside my office safe rested my financial ledgers, the deeds to the property, and the architectural blueprints of the house. If an invasion was coming, my inner sanctums would remain completely impenetrable. Tuesday arrived with the grinding crunch of heavy tires on my driveway. A large rented box truck parked aggressively across the lawn. Gary and Linda stepped out of the vehicle. They did not knock on my front door. They did not seek me out to offer a greeting or express gratitude for the shelter. Linda immediately began complaining in a loud, shrill voice about how the coastal humidity was going to absolutely ruin her hair, fanning her face with profound irritation. Gary marched directly through my front entrance, leaving the door wide open behind him, and began shouting orders at 2 hired movers carrying boxes. I stood in the hallway, watching silently as Gary pointed a thick finger at an antique mahogany credenza resting against the living room wall. "Drag that old junk out to the curb," Gary ordered the movers, clapping his hands together. "I need that entire wall cleared out immediately to make room for my massive home theater setup." The credenza did not belong to him. It was the very first piece of furniture my late wife and I had bought together 40 years ago. It held her favorite books, her old journals, and the physical weight of a life we had built before she passed away. I stepped forward, intercepting the movers before their calloused hands could even touch the wood. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my money clip and held it out to the larger of the 2 men. "Put his theater setup back in the truck," I told him quietly. The mover glanced at Gary, looked down at the money, and took the cash without a single word. I picked up the heavy end of the credenza myself, signaling the other mover to help me carry it down the hall and straight into my home office. Once it was safely inside, I stepped out, pulled the door shut, and locked the new commercial deadbolt with a heavy, satisfying click. Gary was shaking with rage. His face turned deep crimson as he watched his theater equipment being loaded back onto the truck. He pulled out his phone and immediately dialed Travis. I could hear his loud, aggressive complaints echoing down the hallway, twisting a domestic annoyance into a severe, coordinated family threat against my authority in my own home. My phone rang 10 minutes later. It was Travis, and his tone was laced with pure venom. "You listen to me," he hissed into the receiver, dropping all pretense of respect. "You are going to accommodate my parents comfortably, or I will personally make sure you never see your granddaughter again." He weaponized my own flesh and blood, using a child as a bargaining chip to secure free lodging for his entitled parents. I did not respond to the threat. I ended the call in absolute silence, dropping the phone into my pocket. That evening, Linda attempted to assert total dominance over the shared space. I had gone to the market earlier, stocking the refrigerator with fresh produce, lean meats, and my usual provisions. When I walked into the kitchen to prepare dinner, I found the refrigerator completely empty of my food. Linda was standing by the sink, unpacking dozens of expensive, esoteric organic dietary supplements and strange glass bottles into the crisper drawers. I looked at the kitchen trash can. My fresh groceries were shoved inside, ruined. "Your diet is completely unfit for a shared household," Linda proclaimed loudly, not even bothering to look at me. "We require a holistic environment, and those processed toxins you eat are disrupting the energy of the space." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with a woman who felt entitled to destroy my property. I calmly opened the refrigerator, gathered every single one of her expensive supplements, placed them into a heavy black garbage bag, and carried them out to the back porch, dropping them on the floorboards. Then, I walked to the utility closet and physically unplugged the main internet router, resetting the network configurations and completely changing the Wi-Fi password. Less than an hour later, Gary stormed out of the guest wing. He demanded the new password, claiming he needed to log into a remote work server immediately to conduct his business. I looked at him from my armchair, perfectly calm. "I am providing you with a roof," I informed him quietly. "High-speed internet is not included in free lodging. You will have to find a local coffee shop." My silent resistance infuriated him. It forced him to retaliate with a brazen escalation. The very next morning, the doorbell rang at 8 o'clock. I opened it to find 3 men in heavy work boots carrying sledgehammers and drywall saws. They were unlicensed contractors. The lead worker looked past me, asking for Gary. Gary stepped out of the guest wing, a smug grin plastered across his face, and told the men they were going to be knocking down the load, bearing wall between the 2 guest bedrooms to quote an expansive master suite renovation. He was officially attempting to modify my property without my consent. I stepped directly into the path of the lead contractor, blocking the hallway. I demanded to see the work order. The man, looking confused and slightly intimidated by my demeanor, handed me his clipboard. My eyes scanned the document. At the bottom of the page authorizing the structural demolition of my home was a signature. It was signed by Travis. Underneath his name, he had listed himself fraudulently as the property co-owner. The contractor rubbed the back of his neck, casually mentioning that Travis had ordered the quote specifically to increase the overall resale value of the home for an upcoming market listing. The air in my lungs went completely still. They were not just looking for a free place to stay while they got back on their feet. They were actively preparing to sell my home out from under me. I turned to the contractors and pointed toward the front door. "You are trespassing on private property," I told them, my voice deadly calm. "If you are not off my driveway in 30 seconds, you will be leaving in the back of a police cruiser." The men did not hesitate. They grabbed their tools and practically ran out the door, leaving Gary sputtering in the hallway. I did not waste a single word on him. I walked straight into my locked office, my mind racing through the implications of what I had just discovered. If Travis was brazen enough to forge his name as a co-owner on a demolition permit, what else was he doing behind my back? This realization forced me to log into my primary banking portal. I needed to verify exactly how much liquid assets I had available to hire a litigator and bury Travis in a legal battle. I navigated through my accounts, my eyes scanning the balances. My personal checking was fine. My retirement accounts were secure. But then I clicked on the joint emergency savings account. It was an account I had established years ago, sharing access with my daughter Megan, so she would always have a safety net if the worst ever happened. I had bailed Travis out of 2 separate failed business ventures in the past, handing over thousands of dollars to keep my daughter from experiencing financial ruin. But I had explicitly forbidden them from ever touching this specific fund. I stared at the screen. The numbers blurred together for a fraction of a second. The account balance read zero. $45,000 had been entirely drained. The transaction history showed a single massive wire transfer initiated just 48 hours ago. It was routed directly to an external business account registered to Travis. The betrayal was absolute. I picked up my phone and dialed Megan. When she answered, her voice trembled before I even asked the question. She stammered out a weak, rehearsed excuse about a temporary cash flow problem with a new startup Travis was launching, promising with frantic desperation that the money would be fully repaid by the end of the quarter. I listened to my daughter lie to me, recognizing the manipulative echo of her husband's instructions in her voice. I did not berate her. I told her I understood, and I hung up the phone. I quietly closed the joint account online, absorbing the massive financial loss without a public outburst. But I immediately initiated a deep dive background check into Travis, Gary, and Linda, using a secure online public records database. The background check revealed the terrifying truth. Gary and Linda did not lose their lease. They were formally evicted for operating an illegal commercial enterprise out of a residential zone, and Travis was listed as a co-defendant on their massive civil lawsuit. They were drowning in legal judgments. Gary and Linda left the house for a long lunch that afternoon, loudly stating they were going to find a restaurant with free internet. They believed I was out on the bay fishing. I returned early, parking my truck out of sight behind the tree line, and slipped into the guest wing. I was not looking for petty revenge. I was looking for their core motive. Beneath a stack of Linda's lifestyle magazines on the nightstand, I found a thick manila folder labeled with my name. Inside were printouts of my private medical records, highlighting a minor concussion I suffered a year ago. Attached to the medical files were highlighted articles detailing the symptoms of early-onset dementia, and clipped to the very back was a blank legal petition for involuntary conservatorship. They were systematically building a fabricated profile to have me legally declared incompetent. The discovery forced me to realize the threat was not just financial. It was a direct, calculated attack on my freedom and my autonomy. I did not confront them with the folder. I left it exactly where I found it. I drove straight to an electronics store and purchased 3 high-definition motion-activated trail cameras, the kind I originally bought for tracking deer on my hunting trips. I returned to the house and covertly installed them deep inside the air conditioning vents in the kitchen, the living room, and the hallway facing my office door. Within 48 hours, the hidden cameras captured the full extent of their psychological warfare. Linda began hiding my car keys, moving my daily heart medication from the bathroom cabinet to the garage shelves, and loudly discussing imaginary conversations we never had to intentionally confuse me. She was actively gaslighting me. The cameras captured her purposefully turning the knob on my gas stove, leaving the burner unlit, allowing the house to fill with invisible toxic fumes. She then stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her phone up to record a video, narrating in a voice dripping with fake tragedy about how my memory was rapidly slipping and how I had almost blown up the house again. The chilling footage proved they were manufacturing physical evidence to validate their upcoming conservatorship petition. They were creating a digital trail of my supposed insanity. I played the part flawlessly to trap them. I feigned confusion when I could not find my keys. I rubbed my temples and apologized profusely for my slipping memory. My total submission made them incredibly arrogant and sloppy. They stopped whispering when they discussed their plans in the kitchen, completely unaware the vent camera was capturing every single word. The audio revealed they were bringing a doctor to the house on Friday to conduct a preliminary psychological evaluation. I had less than 3 days to prepare for a hostile medical ambush designed to strip me of my human rights. Travis arrived unannounced on Friday morning, bringing a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit whom he introduced as a highly recommended geriatric care consultant. The man sat across from me in my own living room, asking patronizing, leading questions, attempting to confuse me about the current year, my daily routine, and the specific locations of my financial assets. I intentionally answered a few questions, vaguely staring blankly at the wall to satisfy their fraudulent narrative. When I excused myself to use the restroom, I slipped my phone set to record audio under Travis's abandoned leather briefcase on the hallway table. Listening to the audio file that night in the locked safety of my office, I heard Travis explicitly admit to the fake doctor that he had forged Megan's signature on a $200,000 line of credit. Travis stated clearly that he needed absolute control of my house to liquidate the property and pay off his fraudulent debt before the bank seized his assets and sent him to a federal penitentiary. The doctor agreed to expedite the incompetency paperwork for a 10% cut of the sale. Travis returned the next morning, completely dropping all pretense of family care. He dropped a heavy power of attorney document directly onto my kitchen table. He looked me dead in the eye, his face twisted in a smug, victorious sneer. "Sign it," he commanded, "or the doctor submits his evaluation to the state tomorrow morning, and you get locked in a memory care ward for the rest of your life." I looked at the paper, then back at him. I asked for 24 hours to review the terms with a clear head. Travis laughed, victorious, and granted me the extension, warning me not to try anything foolish because he had eyes everywhere. The ultimatum established a ticking clock. I had exactly 24 hours to execute a legal maneuver that would completely paralyze Travis's authority without alerting him to my knowledge. I left the house and drove 2 towns over to meet Paul, my former corporate estate attorney. I handed him a flash drive containing the trail cam footage of Linda staging the gas leak, the audio of the fake doctor, and the background check detailing Travis's massive civil liabilities and wire fraud. Paul listened to the audio and confirmed we had enough evidence to send Travis to a federal prison, but I wanted to ensure my property was utterly untouchable forever. I instructed Paul to immediately execute an irrevocable trust. I legally transferred the entire deed of my lake house directly into the trust, naming a heavily funded wounded veterans charity as the sole beneficiary upon my death, while retaining exclusive lifetime residency rights for myself. The moment Paul filed the paperwork electronically with the county clerk, I no longer owned the house on paper. The trust owned it. Travis's forged power of attorney was now completely useless, but I still needed to spring the trap perfectly. I returned home and acted entirely defeated. I sat in my armchair, staring blankly out at the lake, letting Gary and Linda strut around my living room, taking measurements for their upcoming renovations. I anonymously forwarded the audio recording of Travis admitting to the forged line of credit directly to the fraud department of his bank. I was lighting a fire under his feet, so he would be forced to rush his final attack. The bank immediately froze Travis's accounts. Desperate, panicked, and entirely out of time, Travis called a mobile notary and told Gary and Linda to prepare the final paperwork for the next morning. Travis texted the family group chat that he was bringing Megan with him to witness the signing. I realized I must handle the confrontation delicately, to sever my daughter from her manipulative husband without destroying her life in the process. Morning arrived with a violent banging on my door. Travis burst through the front entrance with a bewildered notary and a terrified-looking Megan trailing behind him. He slammed the power of attorney document down on my desk, pointing a shaking finger at the signature line. "Sign it, Dad," he demanded, his eyes wide with manic desperation. "It is over." Megan begged me with tears streaming down her face to just sign the paper so they could be a happy family again and stop fighting. I looked at my daughter, my heart aching for her blindness. I asked her directly and calmly if she knew that Travis had forged her signature on a $200,000 bank loan. Travis turned deathly pale. He screamed at me to shut my mouth and sign the paper, lunging across the desk to grab my wrist and physically force the pen into my hand. His violent outburst confirmed his guilt to Megan, crossing the threshold from financial fraud to physical elder assault. I effortlessly twisted my wrist out of his weak grip. I did not sign his document. Instead, I slid a thick manila envelope across the desk toward him. Inside were the high-resolution photos of Linda turning on the gas stove, the transcripts of his audio confession, and the officially filed documents of the irrevocable trust. I spoke with surgical precision. I informed Travis that the house belonged to a federal trust, that his power of attorney was a worthless piece of trash, and that his medical fraud had been entirely captured on hidden cameras. Travis's entire world crumbled in a fraction of a second. Gary and Linda backed away against the wall, realizing they were directly implicated in a federal conspiracy. The panic in the room was absolute, but the consequences had already arrived at the front door. Heavy knocks echoed through the house. Paul entered the hallway, flanked by the local sheriff and 2 armed deputies. Paul officially informed Travis that the bank had filed criminal charges for wire fraud based on the anonymous tip. The sheriff viewed the trail cam footage of Travis aggressively grabbing my wrist and Linda staging the gas leak on Paul's tablet. Travis attempted to blame his parents, screaming that it was their idea, while Gary shouted that it was entirely Travis's scheme. The alliance shattered instantly as the antagonists turned on each other like cornered rats to save themselves. The sheriff slapped handcuffs on Travis, arresting him for elder assault and severe financial fraud. I turned to Gary and Linda, who were trembling violently in the corner of my office. I gave them exactly 30 minutes to pack their belongings and vacate the premises, or the deputies would arrest them for criminal trespassing and elder endangerment. They scrambled down the hall to the guest wing, frantically throwing their clothes into black garbage bags. Megan stood in the center of the room, watching her husband being escorted out to a police cruiser in handcuffs. She broke down sobbing, apologizing repeatedly for being so blind to his manipulation and cruelty. I wrapped my arm around her shaking shoulders, offering her the guest wing to stay in while she filed for divorce and froze her credit to protect herself from his fallout. The rented moving truck peeled out of my driveway, kicking up a cloud of gravel dust as Gary and Linda fled the property. Paul and the sheriff left shortly after, leaving me to my peace. I stood on my back deck, feeling the cool breeze coming off the bay, and took a slow sip of my coffee. Order had been restored. The silence of the lake house returned unbroken and absolute. I picked up my phone and dialed my daughter. The line rang 3 times before Megan answered. Her voice was thin and hesitant, entirely lacking the confident cadence she usually carried. I did not ask how her day was going. I simply stated the exact figure missing from the joint emergency account: $45,000. The silence stretching across the line was heavy with immediate guilt. She did not express shock. She did not ask if there had been a bank error. She inhaled sharply, a ragged breath that gave away everything I needed to know. Her voice trembled as she tried to string together a coherent sentence. She told me to please not be angry. She stammered out a weak, rehearsed excuse about a temporary cash flow problem with Travis and his latest tech startup. She promised with frantic desperation that the money would be fully repaid by the end of the financial quarter. She said they just needed a bridge loan to keep the servers running and the payroll clear. Listening to her stumble through the lies her husband had clearly fed her made my chest tighten. I had bailed Travis out twice before. 5 years ago, I covered the lease on a failed commercial gym that folded in 6 months. 3 years ago, I liquidated a mutual fund to settle the outstanding invoices for his disastrous real estate flipping venture. I paid those debts to protect my daughter from creditors. But this was entirely different. This was the emergency account I had opened with my late wife. We built that fund over decades, saving surplus freight bonuses to ensure Megan would always have an impenetrable safety net if the world ever turned upside down. Travis had not just stolen money. He had reached into the past and desecrated my wife's legacy to cover his own incompetence. Megan kept talking, her words spilling out in a panicked rush, begging me to understand that Travis was on the verge of a massive breakthrough. She swore he was going to double the return. I cut her off. I did not raise my voice. I did not berate my daughter for her blindness or scream about the betrayal. Yelling would only force her to defend her husband, pushing her further into his corner. I simply told her that I understood the situation completely. I told her goodbye and I pressed the button to end the call. I set the phone down on my heavy oak desk. The silence in my locked office was absolute. I did not pace the room or stare out the window at the dark waters of the bay. Emotion was a luxury I could no longer afford. I opened my laptop and logged directly into my primary banking portal. With a few swift, methodical clicks, I permanently closed the joint savings account. I stripped Megan of all authorization privileges and completely severed the financial tether between us. I watched the screen as the confirmation prompt appeared, officially verifying that the account was terminated. I absorbed the $45,000 loss without a flinch. In the commercial freight business, you learn to recognize a sunk cost. You cut the dead weight before it drags the entire fleet to the bottom of the ocean. The money was gone, but the clarity I purchased with it was invaluable. Travis had crossed a fatal line. He had mistaken my quiet retirement for weakness. He had assumed that an old man living alone on the coast would be too tired, too compliant, or too senile to notice a quiet bleed of his assets. He was wrong. Closing the account was only the first defensive measure. If Travis was desperate enough to drain his wife's emergency fund behind my back, he was desperate enough to attempt a much larger strike. The contractors knocking on my door earlier that morning were proof that he was eyeing the equity of my home. I needed to know exactly what kind of fire Travis was trying to put out. I opened a new tab on my browser. During my 40 years managing logistics and freight, dealing with unreliable vendors and hostile contractors, I learned exactly how to pull the threads of a person's life apart. I accessed a premium online public records database, a specialized tool I used to vet corporate partners before signing million-dollar shipping contracts. I bypassed the standard search parameters and dug straight into the county civil court records, inputting Gary and Linda's full names. The search engine spun for a few seconds before generating a thick, comprehensive list of legal filings. The results populated on my screen, and the arrogant narrative Travis had spun completely disintegrated. Gary and Linda did not simply lose their residential lease because a landlord decided to sell. They were forcefully and aggressively evicted by court order. I pulled up the digitized court transcripts and the official civil judgments. Gary and Linda had been operating an illegal commercial enterprise directly out of their rented suburban home. The documents outlined a massive, unregulated cryptocurrency mining operation. They had bypassed the residential power grid, illegally drawing thousands of watts of unmetered electricity to run racks of overheating servers in their basement. The operation had caused severe electrical damage to the neighborhood grid and resulted in a massive fire hazard that prompted a raid by local code enforcement and the fire marshal. The landlord had sued them for devastating property damage, and the utility companies had filed massive claims for the stolen power. They were utterly ruined, drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal judgments and municipal fines. But the eviction was only the first layer of the deception. I scrolled further down the list of defendants listed on the civil lawsuit. My eyes locked onto the screen. Travis was named as the primary co-defendant. The court documents detailed his exact involvement. Travis was the registered owner of the server equipment. He was the architect of the illegal mining operation. He had used his parents' basement to hide the hardware, promising them a massive cut of the non-existent profits. When the authorities raided the house and the lawsuits started flying, the financial liability fell squarely on all three of them. Travis was not running a struggling tech startup. He was actively running from a massive, coordinated legal prosecution. The $45,000 he stole from my daughter was not bridge capital. It was a desperate, panicked payment to keep a team of corporate lawyers from throwing him and his parents into a federal penitentiary. The entire picture crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. Gary and Linda moving into my guest wing was not a temporary housing solution. It was a calculated occupation. Travis had moved his radioactive parents into my pristine, fully paid-off lake house because they had absolutely nowhere else to go, and their combined debt was suffocating him. He was using my property as a staging ground for his own survival, and the unlicensed contractors he sent to knock down my walls were the ultimate proof of his endgame. He intended to force a rapid remodel, manipulate the title of my estate, and sell my sanctuary out from under me to pay off his massive criminal liabilities. The audacity of his scheme was staggering. He was willing to render me homeless and destitute to save his own skin. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the dark office. Travis believed he was outsmarting a tired old man. He thought I was nothing more than an open checkbook and a convenient piece of real estate. He had no idea that he had just handed me the exact blueprints to his own destruction. I closed the public records portal and cleared my browser history. I knew I had to act with absolute precision. I could not confront them with this information yet. If I showed my hand now, Travis would panic, and a panicked man with nothing to lose is incredibly dangerous. I needed to let them feel comfortable. I needed to let them believe their hostile takeover was proceeding exactly as planned. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the door. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and stepped out into the quiet hallway. I could hear the faint sound of the television coming from the guest wing, accompanied by Gary's loud, booming laughter. They were making themselves entirely at home on my property, drinking my coffee, sleeping in my beds, and actively plotting my financial ruin. I walked into the kitchen, my expression perfectly neutral, ready to face the very people who were trying to bury me. I knew the next phase of their attack was imminent. They had failed to secure the renovation quote, and they knew the stolen funds would not keep their creditors at bay forever. They needed full control of my assets, and they needed it immediately. They were going to have to escalate their tactics from financial manipulation to psychological warfare, and I was going to be ready for them. I watched from the tree line, keeping my truck completely hidden behind a dense cluster of old weeping willows bordering the edge of my property. Gary and Linda walked out the front door, their voices carrying clearly across the damp morning air. Linda was complaining loudly about the lack of upscale dining in my quiet coastal town, whining that the salt air was making her skin feel sticky. Gary grunted in agreement, jingling his keys before they climbed into their financed luxury sport utility vehicle. They pulled out of my driveway with aggressive speed, kicking up a spray of my white gravel onto the lawn. They firmly believed I was miles out on the bay, sitting in my skiff and chasing striped bass until dusk. I waited exactly 15 minutes in the absolute silence of the trees to ensure that they were not coming back for a forgotten wallet or a misplaced phone. When I was certain the road was clear, I stepped out from the willows, walked up the wooden porch steps, and entered my own home like a shadow. The guest wing smelled sharply of heavy floral perfume and stale takeout food. It was a visceral violation of the quiet, clean space my wife and I had meticulously maintained. I did not care about the mess scattered across the floor. I was not a petty man looking to break a television screen, steal a laptop, or throw their expensive clothes out onto the wet grass. My 40 years running commercial freight operations taught me that when a hostile entity infiltrates your territory, you do not retaliate blindly with brute force. You locate their ledger. You find their operational motive. I moved methodically through the first bedroom. Gary had set up his massive dual monitors and trading computers directly on top of my late wife's delicate sewing table, scratching the varnished wood. I ignored the glowing screens entirely. I checked the drawers, sliding them open with practiced silence. They held nothing but tangled charging cables and crumpled fast food receipts. I moved down the hall to the second bedroom, the larger suite that Linda had aggressively claimed as her personal sanctuary. Stacks of glossy lifestyle magazines littered the bedside table, carelessly tossed over empty coffee mugs. Discarded shipping boxes from her obscure, overpriced dietary supplements piled up in the corner of the room. I systematically checked the closet shelves, ran my hands beneath the underbed storage containers, and sifted through the dresser drawers. I found nothing incriminating. I was about to leave the room when I noticed a slight, unnatural misalignment of the magazines stacked on the nightstand. A heavy, thick manila folder rested beneath the glossy pages, the edge barely protruding over the wood. I reached out and slid the folder free. My full legal name, Douglas Arthur Carter, was written across the top tab in thick black ink. I immediately recognized the sharp, aggressive handwriting. It was Travis. I flipped open the heavy flap. The very first page was a printed email chain. It was official correspondence between Travis and the local medical clinic I had used for 20 years. I read the text, my blood running instantly cold in my veins. Travis had impersonated my emergency contact over the phone feeding the clinic, a fabricated story about needing my comprehensive medical history to update my premium life insurance policies. He had somehow managed to bypass their security protocols and procure my private health records. I turned the page, my jaw clenching tight. There was the official summary of a hospital visit from over 14 months ago detailing a minor concussion I had suffered after slipping on the wet, icy dock during a severe winter storm. Someone had taken a bright yellow marker and highlighted a specific sentence deep in the doctor's notes. The glowing yellow line illuminated the words, mild cognitive disorientation, secondary to blunt head trauma. I kept digging through the invasive file. Beneath the stolen medical records was a thick stack of printed medical journals and psychological articles. They were heavily highlighted with aggressive notes scribbled in the margins. The titles of the articles were a clear, undeniable roadmap to their sinister conspiracy. Early warning signs of severe dementia. How to identify cognitive decline in aging parents. The legal threshold for establishing elder incompetence. Next to these articles was a handwritten daily timeline on a legal pad. It meticulously detailed my personal routines. It tracked the exact times I took my heart medication, the specific days I drove my truck into town for supplies, and crude notes on which conversation topics easily agitated me. They were actively studying me. They were cataloging my life like researchers examining a lab rat to manufacture a convincing narrative of rapid mental decay. But the final document waiting at the bottom of the folder was the actual weapon. It was a multi-page legal form printed on thick, watermarked legal paper. I stared at the bold heading across the top of the page. Petition for appointment of probate conservator. It was a completely blank petition for involuntary conservatorship ready to be filed with the county court. I read through the sterile, bureaucratic text. The document was explicitly designed to strip a human being of their fundamental rights. If signed by a judge, it would transfer absolute control of my medical decisions, my living arrangements, and my entire financial portfolio directly to the appointed conservator. I looked down at the designated conservator field on the second page. The name already neatly typed into the blank space was Travis. The entire scheme locked into place with terrifying mathematical precision. Gary and Linda, occupying my guest wing, was never just about scoring free rent after their illegal crypto mining eviction. The forged demolition quote to knock down my walls was not just an arrogant overstep by a greedy son-in-law. Travis needed $200,000 to pay off his fraudulent civil judgments and bank loans. He desperately needed to sell my lake house to cover his tracks. But he could not simply forge a deed transfer or a bill of sale. The title company and the closing attorneys would require my physical presence, my valid identification, and a certified notary. To liquidate my estate legally and pocket the cash he needed to become my sole legal guardian. He needed a state judge to officially declare me unfit to manage my own affairs. And to convince a judge, he needed a documented, undeniable history of erratic behavior, a steady stream of worried complaints from live-in witnesses, and a compromised medical professional willing to sign a damning evaluation. Gary and Linda were the embedded witnesses. The daily gaslighting and hidden keys were the manufactured evidence. Travis was the ruthless architect orchestrating my demise from afar. I stood completely still in the middle of the guest bedroom, holding the legal petition that would literally turn me into a penniless prisoner in a locked state-run memory care facility. My daughter Megan had defended Travis blindly for years, shielding him from any real accountability. I had paid off his ruined commercial gym lease 5 years ago to keep her from being evicted onto the street. I had liquidated a high-yield mutual fund to save them from his disastrous real estate flipping ventures. I had absorbed those massive financial losses in absolute silence because a father protects his child no matter the cost. But Travis had tragically misinterpreted my silent protection as utter submission. He looked at a man who had spent 4 decades wrestling corrupt freight unions, navigating catastrophic supply chain disasters, and legally crushing rival transport firms, and he saw only a senile Mark waiting to be fleeced. He believed my quiet retirement by the water was a permanent symptom of weakness. I felt a profound freezing calm wash over my entire body, starting from my chest and radiating down to my fingertips. Anger is loud, sloppy, and deeply predictable. True retaliation requires absolute suffocating silence. If I walked out into the driveway right now, called the sheriff, and threw their belongings out onto the gravel road, they would instantly spin the narrative. They would call Travis, who would show the responding officers my stolen medical records. They would claim I was suffering a violent, unprovoked paranoid episode. They would use my perfectly justified outrage as the final indisputable piece of evidence they needed to rush the emergency conservatorship petition to a judge by tomorrow morning. I could not act with force. I could not yell or threaten them. I had to let them continue their vile performance. I had to let them build their trap so incredibly deep that they could never climb out of it once the steel jaws snapped shut. I carefully realigned the papers, sliding the heavy conservatorship petition to the very back of the stack. I placed the highlighted medical journals and my stolen hospital records exactly as I had found them. I slipped the thick manila folder back underneath the glossy lifestyle magazines on the nightstand, ensuring the edge protruded at the precise, careless angle Linda had left it. I smoothed out the fabric of the bedspread where my boots had brushed against the mattress. I walked out of the guest wing, closing the door slowly until the metal latch clicked silently into the strike plate. I walked into my kitchen, turned on the faucet, washed my hands with freezing cold water, and looked out the window at the calm, dark surface of the bay. They wanted to prove my mind was failing. They wanted to document a confused, erratic, helpless old man who could no longer survive on his own. I decided right then, staring out at the water, that I would give them the exact performance they required to hang themselves. I would be the perfect compliant victim, entirely unaware of the slaughter waiting for them in the dark. I walked away from the guest room with a profound, freezing calm that sharpened every nerve in my body. A piece of paper hidden beneath a stack of magazines was not a crime I could report to the authorities. It was merely intent. To destroy Travis and his parents completely, I needed them to execute their plan while I watched from the dark. I needed undeniable proof of their conspiracy. I walked into the kitchen where Gary and Linda were busy complaining about the lack of premium cable channels on my television. I told them I was driving into town to pick up supplies for the boat. They barely acknowledged my departure, already treating me as a ghost in my own home. I drove 30 miles past the local hardware store to a specialized electronics retailer in the next county over. I needed surveillance equipment that would never connect to the compromised wireless network of my house. I purchased 3 high-definition motion-activated trail cameras. These were the exact heavy-duty models I used decades ago to track wildlife on my hunting leases. They operated entirely on internal lithium batteries and recorded directly to hidden memory cards, remaining completely invisible to any digital sweep Travis might try to run remotely. I paid in cash and drove back to the lake house. I returned just as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the water. Gary and Linda were out on the back deck drinking my expensive bourbon and laughing loudly at a video on a phone. I used their distraction to move through my house with practiced efficiency. I grabbed a step stool and unscrewed the metal grates of the central air conditioning vents. I placed the first camera deep inside the kitchen duct, angling the lens to capture the stove and the central island. I installed the second camera in the main living room vent, giving me a clear, unobstructed view of the front door and the seating area. The third camera went into the hallway, positioned in the dark shadows of the grate to monitor the entrance to my locked home office. I secured the grates back into place and meticulously wiped away any trace of dust or fingerprints. The next 48 hours became an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. I played my role to perfection, to give them a false sense of absolute control. When I sat at the dinner table, I intentionally asked Linda the exact same question twice in a row. I watched her eyes light up with predatory excitement. I left a coffee mug in the wrong cupboard. I pretended to misplace my reading glasses, letting Gary find them, with a heavy theatrical sigh. Every single time I showed a fabricated sign of weakness, they grew bolder and more careless. They stopped treating me like a host and started treating me like an inmate waiting for transfer. On the morning of the second day, the true depth of their depravity revealed itself. I told them I was going down to the dock to clean the boat motor. I walked out the back door, letting the screen slam shut behind me, but I did not walk down to the water. I crept around the perimeter of the house, staying completely out of sight, and slipped into the detached garage. I waited in the damp shadows for 2 hours, watching the driveway through a dusty window. Eventually, Gary and Linda walked out the front door, got into their vehicle, and drove away to run errands. When I finally re-entered the house, a thick, nauseating odor hit me the moment I crossed the threshold. It was the sharp, unmistakable smell of unlit natural gas. The entire house was rapidly filling with toxic fumes. I did not panic or shout. I held my breath, moving silently and swiftly into the kitchen. The front left burner on my premium gas range was turned all the way open, hissing a steady stream of lethal vapor into the enclosed room. I reached out and snapped the dial into the off position. I threw open the kitchen windows and unlocked the patio doors, letting the strong bay breeze sweep through the house to clear the deadly air. I knew immediately this was not an accident of negligence. I grabbed the step stool, unscrewed the kitchen vent, and pulled the hidden trail camera from the duct. I took the small memory card directly into my locked office and slid it into my laptop. The high-definition footage loaded on my screen. I watched the video file timestamped just 45 minutes earlier. The hidden camera captured Linda walking into the empty kitchen. She looked around the room to ensure she was completely alone. She reached out and deliberately twisted the stove dial, stopping the knob exactly between the ignition spark and the full gas flow. She stood there for a few agonizing seconds, letting the invisible gas pour out into the room. Then the footage showed her pulling her cell phone out of her pocket. She stepped back into the hallway doorway, framing the stove perfectly in her shot. She hit record on her device and began to speak. Her voice echoed through my laptop speakers, dripping with a sickening, manufactured panic. "Look at this," she whispered into her phone, her hand trembling intentionally to sell the desperate performance. Doug left the stove on again. "The whole house smells like gas. He is going to kill us all. His memory is completely gone. I do not know what to do anymore. It is not safe for him to be living on his own. We try to help him, but he just forgets everything." I watched the screen as she ended the recording, dropped her phone back into her pocket, and casually walked out of the house, leaving the gas actively running. She had intentionally created a lethal hazard, risking an explosion that could have leveled the entire property and killed anyone inside, just to manufacture a 30-second video clip. They were not simply waiting for my mind to slip. They were actively orchestrating life-threatening scenarios to build a flawless, undeniable portfolio of physical evidence. The sheer, calculated cruelty of her actions settled over me like a heavy blanket of ice. I sat in the dim light of my office, replaying the video file a second time to analyze her facial expressions. There was no hesitation in Linda. There was no guilt. She executed the sabotage with the mundane efficiency of someone folding laundry. This level of coordination confirmed that Travis was directing their every move from a distance. He needed his parents to secure the visual documentation required to bypass standard medical protocols. If a judge saw physical proof of environmental endangerment, the court would waive the standard waiting periods and grant emergency temporary guardianship. That temporary status was all Travis needed to legally list the property on the market and funnel the proceeds into his fraudulent business accounts. The chilling footage staring back at me on the computer screen changed the entire trajectory of my response. This was no longer just a financial defense against a greedy son-in-law trying to steal the equity of my home. They were compiling a fabricated digital archive to attach directly to the conservatorship petition hidden in her bedroom. I realized exactly how their conflict chain was designed to end. They were going to walk into a courtroom play that staged video for a judge and claim I was a severe danger to myself and the public. A judge would look at that footage, see an elderly man allegedly leaving a gas stove running, and sign away my human rights without a second thought. I would be ripped from my home and locked in a facility while Travis liquidated my entire life. The threat was absolute and immediate. My freedom, my dignity, and the sanctuary I had built for my final years were hanging by a thread. I took the memory card out of the computer and slipped it into a secure waterproof case in my floor safe. I then took an empty memory card and placed it back into the kitchen vent to ensure they suspected nothing. I wiped down the countertops, closed the windows, and sat in my armchair facing the lake waiting for them to return. When they finally walked through the front door, complaining about the traffic in town, I greeted them with a vacant, pleasant smile. I asked Gary if he had seen my wallet playing the forgetful old man perfectly. He sneered at me and walked away without answering. I watched them walk down the hall, knowing exactly what they were waiting for now. They were waiting to compile enough staged accidents to justify bringing a corrupted medical professional into my home to finalize the legal paperwork. I could not just sit back and let them build their false reality unchallenged. I had to let them bring the ultimate threat directly to my front door, and I had to neutralize it completely before they ever reached a courthouse. The gaslighting was about to escalate into a medical ambush, and I was going to capture every single second of their treason. The psychological campaign began in earnest the very next morning. The gas stove incident was their heavy artillery, but the daily warfare was a slow dripping poison designed to make me question my own reality and force me into a state of visible agitation. I woke up on Wednesday to find my truck keys completely missing from the brass hook by the front door. For 40 years, my keys had never deviated from that exact spot. I walked into the kitchen where Linda was aggressively stirring a cup of herbal tea. I asked her if she had seen them. She looked at me with a sickening display of exaggerated pity. She told me I had put them in the freezer the night before. She led me to the refrigerator, opened the freezer door, and pointed. My keys were resting on top of a box of frozen vegetables, the metal ice cold to the touch. I knew she had placed them there while I was sleeping, but I did not call her a liar. I simply stared at the keys and let a look of absolute bewilderment wash over my face. Their tactics escalated significantly by the afternoon. I walked into my master bathroom to take my prescribed blood pressure medication. The amber plastic bottle was entirely gone from the medicine cabinet. A missing set of keys is a minor inconvenience, but depriving a 66-year-old man of his cardiac medication is a calculated act of physical endangerment. I searched the house for an hour playing the role of a frantic, confused elder. Gary watched me from the living room sofa, his arms crossed over his chest, a smug smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He casually suggested I check the detached garage, claiming he saw me wandering out there earlier, muttering to myself. I walked out to the damp, dusty garage and found the amber bottle sitting precariously on the edge of a rusty metal shelving unit, completely out of reach. They were actively testing my physical and mental limits, probing the perimeter of my patience to see if I would finally snap and give them the violent screaming reaction they needed to call the police. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my anger. Instead, I gave them exactly what their massive egos craved. To defeat a manipulator, you must starve them of their desired reaction and feed them their own assumptions. I walked back into the living room, clutching the amber bottle of pills to my chest. I slumped deeply into my armchair and let my shoulders drop physically, deflating my posture to mimic a man whose spirit had been entirely broken by his own failing mind. I rubbed my temples with shaking fingers, letting out a long, ragged sigh. I looked up at Gary and Linda, my voice trembling with manufactured vulnerability. I apologized to them. I told them my memory was slipping much faster than I had realized, and I thanked them profusely for being so patient with an old fool. The look of supreme arrogant triumph that passed between them was physically nauseating. They truly believed they had conquered me. They believed the fierce, unyielding freight operator who had wrestled corrupt supply chain unions for decades was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic senile shell waiting for his daily instructions. Their perceived victory made them incredibly careless. The fundamental flaw of arrogant predators is that they assume their prey is deaf as well as blind. By Wednesday evening, Gary and Linda completely abandoned the cautious whispering they had practiced during their first few days in the guest wing. They believed I was fast asleep in my master suite, utterly exhausted by the mental strain they had systematically manufactured. They sat openly at the kitchen island, drinking my expensive wine, poring over the legal paperwork Travis had dropped off. They were sitting directly beneath the central air conditioning vent, where my high-definition trail camera was silently recording their every single breath. I sat in the pitch black of my locked home office, a pair of noise-canceling headphones strapped tightly to my ears, watching the live feed stream directly to my encrypted laptop. The microphone on the heavy-duty camera picked up their voices with crystal-clear precision. Linda was swirling the red wine in her glass, complaining bitterly about the damp smell of the lake air. Gary told her to stop whining, promising her that they would only have to endure the rustic environment for a few more weeks. He boasted that once Travis finalized the property transfer, they would take their substantial cut of the estate sale and buy a luxury condo down in Boca Raton. They were casually dividing my life savings like pirates, splitting a stolen bounty over a tavern table. But then the conversation shifted, and the true immediate danger materialized on my screen. Gary pulled his cell phone from his pocket and read a text message aloud. It was from Travis. The message detailed the final crucial step of their legal snare. Travis had found a compromised geriatric specialist willing to bypass standard medical ethics protocols. The fake doctor was willing to conduct an off-the-books aggressive psychological evaluation right here in my living room, specifically designed to trigger my frustration and document me as severely uncooperative and hostile. Gary laughed, typing out a quick response on his phone. He told Linda the appointment was locked in for Friday morning. Travis was bringing the specialist directly to the lake house to ambush me before I had any chance to contact an independent physician or secure legal representation. I paused the video playback, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. Friday morning. I looked down at the digital clock in the corner of my screen. It was currently Wednesday night. I had less than 36 hours to prepare for a hostile medical invasion designed to permanently strip me of my human rights. If this compromised doctor walked through my front door and filed a certified evaluation claiming I was a violent, confused threat to myself and others, Travis would immediately march that document into a county courtroom. A judge would look at the doctor's signature, review Linda's staged videos of the unlit gas stove and the misplaced medications, and sign the emergency conservatorship order without hesitation. I would be forcibly removed from my home by local law enforcement and locked in a state-mandated medical ward while Travis liquidated my entire legacy to pay off his criminal debts. The sheer brazen arrogance of their timeline was staggering. They thought they could simply walk a fraudulent medical professional into my private sanctuary and dictate the end of my life. They were relying entirely on the element of surprise, assuming I would be too disoriented and terrified by the sudden medical interrogation to defend myself coherently. But they did not realize they were walking blindly into a fully monitored operational theater. The hidden cameras and microphones had transformed my home from a trap into a heavily fortified bunker, and I was holding the master switch. I removed the headphones and sat in the quiet dark of my office. I could not cancel the appointment. I could not lock the doors and refuse them entry on Friday morning. Avoiding the ambush would only delay the inevitable and force Travis to seek an alternative, perhaps even more dangerous method of proving my incompetence. I had to let the fake doctor cross my threshold. I had to let him sit in my armchair, open his notepad, and begin his fraudulent interrogation. I needed him to commit his medical malpractice on the digital record. But to turn their ultimate weapon against them, I needed an ironclad defense that operated entirely outside the corrupt medical system they were trying to exploit. I needed a legal guillotine that would sever Travis's authority the exact second he tried to claim it. I shut down the laptop and locked it back inside the heavy steel floor safe. The time for gathering intelligence was officially over. I had all the audio and visual evidence I needed to prove their malicious intent to a grand jury. Now I had to secure the payload. I had to mobilize my own forces and lay the groundwork for a counteroffensive so devastating that Travis and his parents would never recover from the financial and legal fallout. I knew exactly who to call when the sun came up, and I knew exactly how to render my estate entirely untouchable before Friday morning arrived. Friday morning broke with a heavy blanket of fog rolling off the bay. I sat in my armchair facing the water, my coffee growing cold on the side table. I knew they were coming. The cameras had warned me. At precisely 10 in the morning, the gravel in the driveway crunched under the tires of an unfamiliar vehicle. I did not move. I heard the heavy front door open without a knock. Travis walked into my home with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he had already won. Behind him trailed a short, nervous-looking man wearing a cheap gray suit that hung loosely off his shoulders. The man carried a scuffed leather briefcase and avoided looking directly at anything. Travis did not offer a greeting. He walked straight into my living room, flanked by his hired accomplice, and stood over my chair. He announced that this was a geriatric care consultant he had brought in to check on my health. He claimed Megan was deeply worried about my recent memory lapses and wanted a professional opinion. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. Gary and Linda emerged from the guest wing exactly on cue. They stood in the background, crossing their arms and wearing identical expressions of manufactured concern. I looked up at the man in the cheap suit. He did not carry the quiet authority of a medical professional. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the expensive fixtures and the unobstructed view of the water, calculating the value of the estate rather than the health of the patient. I did not challenge his credentials. I slowly pushed myself out of my chair, using the armrests for support, playing the part of a frail and weary old man. I offered the doctor a weak smile and told him I was perfectly happy to answer any questions if it would put my daughter at ease. Travis smirked, clearly thrilled by my total lack of resistance. He threw his heavy wool coat onto the hallway console table, dropping his keys beside it, and directed the doctor to sit across from me on the sofa. The interview was not a medical evaluation. It was a targeted, patronizing interrogation designed to extract a specific narrative. The man opened his briefcase, pulled out a generic legal pad, and clicked his pen. He spoke to me in a slow, exaggerated tone as if he were addressing a toddler. He began with simple orientation questions. He asked me to state my full name, the current date, and the season. I answered slowly. I intentionally hesitated on the date, rubbing my forehead, as if trying to push through a thick mental fog, and gave him the wrong day of the week. I saw Gary nod subtly in the background. The fake doctor scribbled furiously on his pad. He moved on to my daily routines, asking how I managed my meals and my medications. I lowered my gaze to the floor and admitted that I had been struggling lately. I told him I sometimes forgot to turn off the stove and that I had completely misplaced my heart pills just a few days ago. The questions then shifted exactly where I knew they would. The doctor leaned forward, dropping the patronizing tone for something much sharper. He asked me if I felt overwhelmed by the burden of managing such a large property. He asked if I had trouble keeping track of my bank accounts, my property taxes, and my investment portfolios. He was pressing me to admit financial incompetence on the record. I let out a long, ragged breath. I looked at Travis, projecting total defeat. I quietly confessed that the numbers were becoming confusing. I said the bank statements looked like a foreign language to me lately, and that I was deeply worried about losing track of my assets. Travis shifted his weight, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. The doctor wrote down my manufactured confession, pressing his pen so hard into the paper it nearly tore through the page. The timing had to be absolute. I rubbed my eyes, letting a slight tremor enter my hands. I told them I was feeling incredibly fatigued by the questions and desperately needed to use the restroom. The fake doctor graciously allowed the break, telling me to take my time. I slowly stood up and shuffled out of the living room, keeping my head bowed. As I entered the hallway, I passed the console table where Travis had thrown his coat. My smartphone was already in my pocket. The screen was darkened, but the voice memo application was actively recording. I slipped my hand into my pocket, gripped the device, and smoothly slid it directly under the folds of the heavy wool coat. The fabric completely concealed the phone. I walked into the restroom, closed the door, and locked it. I turned on the sink faucet to muffle any sound. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I had to stay in the bathroom long enough for them to speak freely. Arrogant men cannot tolerate silence. They need to congratulate themselves. They need to validate their own perceived brilliance. I waited for exactly 7 minutes. I counted the seconds in my head, breathing evenly, letting the cold water run. When the time elapsed, I turned off the faucet, dried my face, and shuffled back out into the hallway. The voices in the living room ceased the exact moment my footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor. I walked back to my armchair and sat down heavily. The fake doctor closed his legal pad and packed his pen away. He looked at me with fake sympathy and told me he had gathered all the information he needed. He said he would compile his report and send it to Travis by tomorrow. Travis picked up his coat from the hallway table, completely unaware of the hidden device resting just inches from his hand. I casually picked up a nearby stack of mail from the console table as he moved, palming my phone and sliding it back into my pocket in one fluid, unbroken motion. My 40 years of overseeing dockyard logistics had required sleight of hand and rapid misdirection more times than I cared to count. Travis never noticed a thing. He told me to get some rest, turned his back on me, and walked out the front door with his hired fraud. Gary and Linda retreated to the guest wing to celebrate their perceived victory, leaving me alone in the silent house. I walked directly into my locked home office. I pulled the heavy shades down over the windows and sat at my desk. I pulled the phone from my pocket, stopped the recording, and immediately uploaded the audio file to my secure, encrypted laptop. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and opened the file. I fast-forwarded through the initial 7 minutes of the interview, skipping past my own manufactured confusion until I reached the exact moment I had closed the restroom door. The audio was crisp and undeniable. As soon as I left the room, the fake doctor dropped his professional demeanor completely. His voice was sharp and agitated. He told Travis that this was a massive risk. He complained that fabricating a medical evaluation to strip an independent adult of their civil rights could cost him his medical license and send him to prison. He demanded to know when he was getting his cut of the estate. Travis hissed at him to lower his voice. I listened closely as Travis began to speak. Panic and desperation bled through his arrogant facade. Travis told the doctor that the payoff was guaranteed the moment the judge signed the conservatorship. But the doctor refused to back down, pressing Travis on why they had to move so dangerously fast. The silence on the recording lasted for 3 agonizing seconds before Travis finally cracked. He admitted the truth in a frantic, hushed whisper. He told the doctor that the illegal crypto mining lawsuits had completely wiped him out. He was completely broke, but he had managed to secure a $200,000 line of credit from a commercial bank to keep his creditors at bay. The doctor asked how a man drowning in civil judgments could possibly secure a massive commercial loan. Travis confessed everything. He explicitly stated that he had forged Megan inking the loan documents. He had used my daughter and her pristine credit history and her clean financial background to secure the funds without her knowledge or consent. He had committed severe wire fraud and identity theft against his own wife. But the money was already gone, swallowed up by the massive municipal fines and the predatory lawyers trying to keep him out of jail. The bank was demanding the first repayment, and they were threatening to audit the loan documents if he defaulted. If the bank initiated a fraud investigation, they would contact Megan directly. The forgery would be exposed, and Travis would face decades in a federal penitentiary. Travis needed control of my lake house because it was the only clean, unencumbered asset left in his orbit. He intended to use the fraudulent medical evaluation to secure emergency guardianship, list the property for a rapid cash sale, and use my life savings to pay off the forged commercial loan before the bank auditors triggered a federal investigation. He was willing to destroy my life, strip me of my freedom, and leave my daughter financially ruined, just to cover his own criminal tracks. The audio recording ended with Travis promising the fake doctor $50,000 from the sale of my house if he submitted the incompetency paperwork to the court by tomorrow morning. I removed my headphones and set them down on the desk. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was absolute. He had not only targeted me, but he had actively victimized my daughter, treating her entire future as collateral damage for his own survival. Travis had built a house of cards on a foundation of federal felonies. He believed he was holding all the winning pieces, completely unaware that his entire confession was sitting on my hard drive. I had the undeniable proof required to send him to prison. The waiting game was officially over. I picked up my phone and opened my contact list. It was time to execute the final counter-strike. The morning sun broke over the water of the bay with a cold light that offered absolutely no warmth. I sat at my kitchen island, drinking black coffee and watching the gray fog roll across the wooden planks of my dock. I knew Travis would not wait long to deliver his final blow. Desperate men cannot tolerate delay because delay allows panic to set in. I heard the heavy tires of his truck bite into the gravel of my driveway just past 8 in the morning. He did not bother to knock on the front door. The heavy wood swung open with a loud thud that echoed through the quiet sanctuary of my home. Travis walked directly into the kitchen with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had already won the war. He did not bring the fake geriatric doctor this time. He did not bring my daughter Megan. He came entirely alone to execute his hostile takeover. Gary and Linda stepped out of the guest hallway right on cue and stood behind him like loyal foot soldiers waiting for their commander to finish off a wounded prisoner. Travis did not offer a polite greeting or ask how I was feeling. He carried a thick stack of legal papers bound inside a dark blue folder. He tossed the folder directly onto the granite countertop in front of my coffee mug. The heavy slap of the paper against the stone sounded exactly like a steel trap snapping shut. He looked down at me, and the mask of the concerned family man completely dissolved. His eyes were hard and flat and filled with a frantic, exhausted greed. He told me the document was a durable power of attorney and a full transfer of medical proxy. He explained that it gave him absolute executive control over my medical decisions, my real estate properties, and my entire banking portfolio. He said it was a necessary step because I could no longer be trusted to manage my own life. I looked at the blue folder and then up at his smug face. I asked him what would happen if I refused to sign away my entire existence. Travis leaned forward and placed both of his hands flat on the kitchen island. He deliberately invaded my personal space to physically intimidate me. He lowered his voice into a cold, dead whisper that made my stomach turn. He told me that if my signature was not on that paper by tomorrow morning, the geriatric specialist would immediately submit his psychological evaluation to the state medical board. Travis spelled out the consequences with sadistic pleasure. He said a judge would review the fabricated videos of me leaving the gas stove running and sign an emergency order before noon. He told me state deputies would arrive at my house, put me in the back of a transport vehicle, and lock me inside a severe memory care ward for the rest of my natural life. He said I would lose my home, my boat, and my dignity, and I would die in a sterile room surrounded by strangers who would not even let me hold my own house keys. Gary and Linda chimed in from the background to reinforce the threat. Linda crossed her arms and said it was the only safe option because I was clearly a massive danger to myself and the surrounding property. She casually mentioned the unlit gas stove incident from yesterday, reminding Travis that they had undeniable video proof of my rapid cognitive decline. Gary chuckled and told me to just sign the paper so they could all get back to their normal lives without babysitting a confused old fool. They were surrounding me and suffocating me with their coordinated lies. They expected me to panic. They expected me to yell or cry or beg for mercy. They wanted me to throw a violent tantrum so they could record my outrage and use it as further proof of my mental instability. I knew that showing any genuine emotion would only fuel their arrogant delusion of control. I looked down at my hands resting on the granite counter. I intentionally allowed a slight tremor to shake my fingers. I slumped my shoulders forward and let my chin drop toward my chest. I took a slow, ragged breath to mimic a man whose spirit had just been completely crushed under the weight of his own failing mind. I reached out and gently touched the cover of the blue folder. I told Travis that this was a massive decision and that I felt very confused and overwhelmed by everything happening around me. I asked him to give me exactly 24 hours to review the legal terms with a clear head so I could process the transition properly. I kept my voice weak and submissive. I watched Travis carefully as I made my request. I watched his massive ego swell and completely blind his rational judgment. A smart criminal would have forced the signature immediately. A smart criminal would have realized that giving a victim time to think is a fatal tactical error. But Travis was not a smart criminal. He was just an arrogant coward drowning in his own financial fraud. He looked at my shaking hands and my bowed head and smiled a sickening, triumphant smirk. He truly believed he had utterly broken the tough old freight manager. He stood up straight and adjusted his jacket collar. He told me I had exactly until tomorrow morning to make peace with reality. He granted me the extension, but he left me with a final chilling warning. He pointed a finger at my chest and told me not to try anything foolish. He claimed he had eyes everywhere, and that any attempt to contact a lawyer or flee the property would trigger the immediate filing of the medical evaluation, and the police would be sent to hunt me down. Travis turned around and walked out of my house without another word. Gary and Linda followed him out to the driveway to celebrate their victory, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet kitchen. I sat in the absolute silence for a long time. The ticking clock had officially started. I had exactly 24 hours before Travis would return to demand the deed to my life. I reached out and opened the blue folder to read the fine print. Travis had drafted a masterpiece of absolute financial theft. The power of attorney was not limited to basic medical decisions or simple banking oversight. It included specific buried clauses that allowed the agent to sell real estate property, liquidate retirement funds, and transfer massive sums of money into private holding accounts without any legal oversight or audit requirements. It was a blank check to steal my entire net worth. He desperately needed this document to legitimize the rapid sale of my lake house so he could pay off the $200,000 fraudulent loan he had taken out in my daughter's name. If he did not get my signature, the commercial bank would audit his business accounts, discover his blatant forgery, and send him to federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. He was gambling his entire freedom on my complete compliance. I closed the folder and pushed it aside. The manufactured tremor in my hands instantly vanished. I sat up straight and took a deep breath of the cool morning air, drifting in from the open patio door. Travis had delivered a terrifying ultimatum, but he had also given me the exact window of time I needed to completely dismantle his authority. He thought he had trapped me in a corner, but he had merely given me 24 hours to build a concrete wall around my estate. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to execute a legal maneuver that was so absolute and irreversible that it would render his power of attorney instantly worthless. I had to sever my name from the property deed without alerting the county clerk system in a way that Travis could track before the trap was fully sprung. I stood up from the kitchen island and walked quietly down the hallway to my locked home office. I needed to gather every single piece of intelligence I had collected over the past week to bring to my attorney. I opened my heavy steel floor safe and retrieved the waterproof case containing the memory cards from the hidden trail cameras. I had the high-definition footage of Linda deliberately leaving the gas stove running. I had the crystal-clear audio file of Travis admitting to a fake doctor that he had committed federal wire fraud and forged his own wife's signature. I had the comprehensive background check detailing Gary and Linda's illegal cryptocurrency mining eviction and the massive civil judgments hanging over their heads. I placed all the physical evidence and digital files into a heavy manila envelope. The weight of the envelope in my hands was the literal weight of their impending destruction. They had spent weeks trying to convince me that my mind was decaying and that I was a helpless old fool who needed to be locked away in a sterile white room. They had weaponized my age and my isolation against me to steal my sanctuary. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. I did not survive 40 years in the cutthroat logistics industry by rolling over when cornered by greedy parasites. I survived by anticipating the enemy's final move and destroying the ground they intended to stand on before they even realized the battle had begun. I looked at the clock on my office wall. It was 9 in the morning. I had exactly 23 hours left to arm the legal guillotine. I slipped the manila envelope into my leather briefcase and locked my office door behind me. It was time to leave the lake house and pay a visit to a man who specialized in turning arrogant predators into penniless prisoners. I left the lake house exactly at 9:30 in the morning. I did not take the main highway because Travis was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid, and I could not risk him having Gary tail my truck. I took the old logging roads cutting through the dense pine forests that separated my quiet coastal town from the bustling commercial district 2 counties over. The drive took just under an hour, the tires of my truck gripping the familiar curves of the asphalt, while the 24-hour countdown echoed relentlessly in my mind. Travis believed he had cornered me. He believed the threat of a locked memory care ward had paralyzed my spirit. He had completely forgotten that a cornered predator is the most dangerous entity in the woods. I parked my truck in the underground garage of a sleek, glass and steel high-rise building in the center of the financial district. I took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The frosted glass doors sliding open revealed the polished reception area of Paul Sterling and Associates. Paul had been my chief corporate counsel for 25 years. During my decades managing commercial freight operations, Paul was the legal architect who helped me dismantle corrupt shipping unions and ruthlessly acquire bankrupt transport rivals. He was not a warm man. He did not offer emotional support or sympathetic smiles. He dealt exclusively in leveraged liability and absolute legal destruction. That was exactly why I needed him now. The receptionist recognized me instantly and ushered me directly into his corner office. Paul was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of contracts. He looked up, his sharp gray eyes taking in my sudden appearance without a flicker of surprise. He motioned for me to sit. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I pulled the heavy manila envelope from my leather briefcase and placed it squarely in the center of his desk. I slid the encrypted flash drive across the polished wood. I told him I needed him to secure my entire estate before the banks opened tomorrow morning. Paul inserted the drive into his computer. I sat in absolute silence as he opened the files. I watched his face as he reviewed the high-definition footage of Linda intentionally leaving the natural gas stove running in my kitchen to manufacture a fraudulent emergency video. His expression remained entirely neutral, but the grip on his pen tightened. Then he opened the audio file. The crystal-clear recording of Travis plotting with the fake geriatric doctor filled the quiet office. Travis explicitly admitted to forging my daughter Megan's signature on a $200,000 commercial line of credit to cover his disastrous cryptocurrency mining debts. He detailed his exact plan to use a fabricated psychological evaluation to seize control of my lake house, liquidate the property, and pay off the fraudulent bank loan before federal auditors caught his trail. When the audio file ended, Paul leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. He looked at me with cold, professional precision. He stated that we had undeniable evidence of conspiracy to commit elder abuse, attempted extortion, criminal forgery, and massive federal wire fraud. He said Travis was holding a lit stick of dynamite, and we had the power to send him to a federal penitentiary for the next 15 years. Paul reached for his office phone, telling me he was going to contact his liaison at the district attorney's office to have Travis arrested before noon. I reached across the desk and gently pushed his hand away from the receiver. I told him the police could wait. I explained that if we arrested Travis right now, the criminal justice system would take months to freeze the assets, and Gary and Linda would immediately flee the state to avoid prosecution. More importantly, Travis was currently holding a completed power of attorney document that he intended to force me to sign by tomorrow morning. If I simply had him arrested, the underlying vulnerability of my estate remained. I needed to ensure that even if Travis managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system, my property would be entirely untouchable for the rest of eternity. I needed to build a fortress that no greedy relative or corrupt doctor could ever breach. Paul lowered his hand and asked me exactly how I wanted to proceed. I told him I wanted to execute an irrevocable trust immediately. I had spent 40 years building my wealth, and I was fully prepared to part with the ownership of my greatest asset to guarantee Travis would never touch a single dime. I instructed Paul to legally transfer the deed of my lake house directly into the trust. I would no longer own the property on paper. The trust would become the absolute legal entity holding the title. Paul warned me of the profound weight of this decision. He reminded me that an irrevocable trust could not be modified, amended, or terminated once it was signed. By transferring the deed, I was permanently relinquishing my direct ownership of the estate. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was completely aware of the finality. I instructed him to draft the specific terms. I would retain exclusive lifetime residency rights, guaranteeing that I could live in the house undisturbed until the day I drew my last breath. No one could evict me, and no one could sell the property out from under me. Paul asked who the ultimate beneficiary of the trust would be upon my death. I did not hesitate. During my time managing dockyard logistics, I had worked alongside countless young men who had returned from overseas deployments, with shattered bodies and fractured minds. I told Paul to name the National Wounded Veterans Coalition as the sole beneficiary. When I passed away, the house would be liquidated by the trust, and every single dollar of equity would go directly toward funding housing and medical care for paralyzed combat veterans. My daughter Megan was already financially secure with her own career, and I would leave her my liquid cash savings in a separate protected account. But the lake house, the ultimate prize that Travis was willing to destroy my life to steal, would be given entirely to men and women who had actually bled for their country. A rare, sharp smile broke across Paul's face. He understood the strategic brilliance of the maneuver immediately. By placing the house into an irrevocable trust, the property simply ceased to exist as a personal asset in my name. The power of attorney document. Travis was currently holding hostage in my kitchen, was now a completely worthless piece of paper. Even if Travis successfully bribed a judge, even if he managed to have me declared severely incompetent and locked in a memory care ward, he could not sell a house that I no longer legally owned. A conservator can only manage the assets belonging to the ward. If the trust owned the estate, Travis would gain absolutely nothing but legal fees and empty hands. Paul stood up and called his senior clerks into the office. The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of aggressive legal execution. Teams of paralegals drafted the trust documents, verified the property boundaries, and prepared the deed transfer paperwork for immediate electronic filing with the county clerk. I sat in the leather chair drinking black coffee, watching my longtime ally construct an impenetrable titanium vault around my life's work. Just past 1 in the afternoon, Paul placed a thick stack of finalized documents on the desk in front of me. A public notary stood by to witness the execution. I picked up the heavy brass pen. I did not feel any hesitation or sorrow as I signed away the deed to my beloved lake house. I felt a profound, exhilarating rush of absolute freedom. With every signature, I was severing the strings Travis was trying to attach to my limbs. With every initial on the margins of the trust, I was locking the doors of the bank vault and throwing the key into the deepest trench of the ocean. When the final seal was stamped on the paper, Paul immediately submitted the electronic filing to the state registry. He looked at his computer monitor and confirmed that the transaction was officially recorded. The lake house now belonged to the trust. The trap was fully armed and locked into place. Paul handed me a certified copy of the trust execution and asked if I was ready to bring the criminal evidence to the federal authorities. I took the certified documents and slid them into my briefcase alongside the original copies of the surveillance evidence. I told Paul that the authorities would get their turn very soon. But the ultimatum Travis had issued established a strict 24-hour window, and I intended to use every remaining second to maximize his destruction. Travis believed he was going to walk into my kitchen tomorrow morning and collect the keys to his financial salvation. He believed his psychological warfare had broken me into complete submission. I had to let him spring his own trap. I had to let him commit to the extortion on the record so he could not claim it was a simple misunderstanding. I thanked Paul for his ruthless efficiency and walked out of the high-rise building. I drove my truck back down the winding logging roads toward the coast. The fog had burned off, leaving the afternoon sky a brilliant, blinding blue. I did not feel like a hunted man returning to a hostile prison. I felt like an apex predator circling back to an open cage. I had successfully completely paralyzed Travis's authority without him suspecting a single thing. His power of attorney was now an artifact of a fictional reality. Tomorrow morning, he would drop the heavy blue folder on my counter and demand my life. And tomorrow morning, I would gladly sign my name on his worthless paper, knowing he was stepping blindly onto a live landmine that would blow his entire fraudulent existence into ash. I pulled my truck back into the long gravel driveway of my property, just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the heavy pine trees. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a few moments, letting the absolute certainty of my plan settle into my bones. I had to walk back into that house and deliver the greatest performance of my entire life. I had to convince two ruthless predators that they had completely drained the life from my veins. I let my shoulders slump forward, intentionally curving my spine to mimic the hollow posture of a defeated man. I climbed out of the truck, dragging my boots against the white gravel, making my footsteps sound heavy and uncoordinated. I walked up the wooden porch steps and opened the front door without making a sound. The air inside the house was thick with the arrogant energy of an occupying force. Gary and Linda were standing in the center of the kitchen, completely ignoring my return. I did not greet them or look in their direction. I kept my chin tucked down toward my chest, shuffling slowly across the hardwood floors until I reached my leather armchair, facing the large bay windows. I sank into the cushions, letting out a long, ragged sigh that rattled in my chest. I rested my shaking hands on my lap and stared blankly out at the dark surface of the lake. I became a silent ghost haunting my own living room. I presented them with the exact image of a broken elder who had finally surrendered his mind to the void. My total submission acted like an accelerant on their massive egos. They stopped pretending I was a human being with feelings and started treating me like a piece of obsolete furniture waiting to be hauled away to the dump. Gary walked into the main living space holding a yellow metal tape measure. He pulled the steel tape across the floorboards with a loud, aggressive snap, measuring the distance from the fireplace to the hallway. Linda trailed right behind him, holding a thick, glossy catalog of luxury interior designs and a legal pad. They began to openly discuss the total demolition of my sanctuary. I listened in absolute silence as Linda pointed at the custom oak cabinets my late wife and I had installed 30 years ago. She coldly stated that the wood looked cheap and outdated, insisting they rip the entire kitchen down to the studs to install imported marble and floating glass shelves. Gary grunted in agreement, scribbling dimensions onto his legal pad. He tapped his pen against the load-bearing wall separating the dining room from the den and proudly announced he could knock it down in an afternoon to create a massive open-concept floor plan. They were verbally tearing down every memory I had ever built inside these walls, dividing the equity of my life into luxury upgrades for a house they planned to flip the second I was locked away in a memory care ward. Their cruelty was staggering, but I did not flinch. I did not clench my jaw or narrow my eyes. I simply stared at the gentle ripples on the lake, maintaining my mask of complete apathy. They were entirely blinded by their own greed. They failed to realize that a true apex predator does not pace angrily when the trap is set. A predator sits perfectly still in the tall grass, waiting for the prey to step onto the trigger. I waited patiently until Gary and Linda moved their measuring tape into the master bathroom to argue about replacing the porcelain tub with a walk-in shower. The moment I heard their voices echoing down the far end of the hallway, I quietly pushed myself out of the armchair. I slipped silently into my locked home office and sat down at my heavy wooden desk. It was time to introduce a catastrophic catalyst into Travis's timeline. Travis had given me 24 hours to sign away my life, but a calculated enemy with time on his side is dangerous. I needed to shatter his timeline. I needed to fill his veins with blinding panic. A panicked criminal abandons caution and rushes headfirst into his own execution. I opened my encrypted laptop and booted up a secure anonymous email server I had configured specifically for this exact moment. I attached the pristine audio file I had extracted from the hidden vent camera. It was the exact recording of Travis standing in my living room, explicitly confessing to the fake geriatric doctor that he had forged my daughter Megan's signature to secure a $200,000 commercial line of credit. I found the direct emergency contact email for the executive fraud and risk management division of Travis's specific commercial bank. I drafted a very brief, sterile message stripped of any personal emotion or identifying details. I simply wrote that the attached audio file contained a direct confession of federal wire fraud and identity theft regarding an active commercial loan account under their management. I did not ask for a response. I clicked send and watched the progress bar push the digital payload across the network. I was dropping a lit match directly into a powder keg. I logged out of the server, closed the laptop, and quietly walked back to my armchair, just as Gary and Linda returned to the kitchen. The waiting required a profound level of psychological endurance. I knew exactly how corporate financial institutions operated when presented with undeniable verified proof of internal fraud. They do not send polite warning letters, and they do not wait for the end of the business day. They act with ruthless mechanical precision to instantly freeze the compromised accounts and stop the hemorrhaging of their capital. I sat in my chair, watching the sun move across the sky, listening to the subtle sounds of the house. Less than 2 hours after I sent the encrypted email, the arrogant atmosphere inside my home completely shattered. The sharp, frantic ringing of Gary's cell phone pierced the quiet afternoon air. I heard him pull the phone from his pocket and answer it with a casual, lazy greeting. Within 3 seconds, his posture snapped completely rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He gripped the edge of the kitchen island so hard his knuckles turned white. I kept my eyes focused on the lake, but I tuned every nerve in my body to the conversation happening 10 feet behind me. Gary's voice spiked into a terrified, hushed whisper. He kept repeating the words frozen and locked out over and over again. He pulled the phone away from his ear and frantically tapped the screen to put the call on speakerphone, completely abandoning any pretense of hiding their criminal conspiracy from the silent old man in the armchair. Travis's voice erupted through the tiny digital speaker. He was not speaking. He was hyperventilating. The calm, smug architect who had threatened to lock me in a medical ward was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate animal caught in a snare. He was screaming at his father that every single one of his business accounts had just been suspended. The bank's executive fraud department had just emailed his corporate attorney demanding an immediate in-person audit of the original loan documents by the end of the week. Travis told Gary that the bank was threatening to contact federal investigators if he could not produce his wife to verify the signature on the commercial credit line. His entire fraudulent empire was collapsing around him in real time. Travis sounded like he was fighting for air through the phone. He told Gary that they were completely out of time. The 24-hour window he had arrogantly granted me that morning was instantly revoked. He screamed that he needed the power of attorney signed today right now so he could legally transfer the title of the lake house to an underground cash buyer he had lined up in the city. He needed the liquid capital in his hands by tomorrow morning to pay off the forged loan before the bank auditors brought the federal authorities to his front door. Travis ordered his parents to get the paperwork out on the table and make sure I was sitting in the kitchen. He told them he was driving over at 90 miles an hour, and he was bringing a mobile notary who was paid well enough to ignore any legal technicalities or signs of elder distress. The phone call abruptly ended, leaving a suffocating, panicked silence in the kitchen. I listened to Gary and Linda scrambling frantically, pulling the blue folder out of their bags and whispering furiously to each other. The trap I had laid was functioning with flawless mathematical precision. The anonymous email had ignited the exact fire I needed. Travis was no longer acting strategically. He was rushing blindly into the dark, sprinting directly toward the absolute legal destruction I had waiting for him. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, staring out at the calm water. The final countdown had accelerated into a dead sprint. The climax of this entire war was currently speeding down the highway, bringing the ultimate confrontation right to my front door. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath, ready to finish the work I had started. The sun finally sank completely below the horizon, plunging the lake house into deep shadows and quiet stillness. I remained in my armchair watching the darkness stretch across the water until the heavy sound of glass clinking against granite broke the silence. Gary and Linda had moved from the guest wing into the main kitchen to begin their premature victory lap. I listened to the distinct sound of a corkscrew driving into a bottle. I recognized the heavy thud of the dark glass on the island and knew exactly what they had taken. It was a rare vintage Bordeaux I had purchased in Paris nearly 2 decades ago to celebrate my 30th wedding anniversary with my late wife. We had promised to open it together when I finally retired from the freight business. I had kept it sealed in the temperature-controlled cellar ever since she passed away, unable to bear the thought of drinking it without her. Gary and Linda did not care about the history or the sentiment attached to the glass. They only cared about the price tag and the temporary thrill of consuming something they could never afford to buy with their own money. I slowly pushed myself out of the armchair and shuffled into the kitchen. Gary was pouring the deep red liquid into 2 of my crystal goblets, completely butchering the cork in his haste. Linda was leaning against the counter, browsing through her glossy interior design catalogs and talking loudly about how much money they would save by hiring unlicensed contractors to tear down my walls. They looked up when I entered the room. Linda offered a cruel, patronizing smile and asked if I was feeling less confused after my long afternoon nap. She spoke to me with the sickly sweet tone a person uses to address a slow child. Gary chuckled and took a long, careless swallow of the Bordeaux, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He told me I should just relax and let Travis handle the heavy lifting from now on, because my mind clearly needed a permanent vacation. They were absolutely convinced my silence was the physical manifestation of total mental surrender. They believed the threat of the memory care ward had successfully terrified me into complete docility. I pulled out a wooden stool and sat down heavily at the kitchen island, directly across from them. I kept my shoulders rounded and my gaze fixed on the marble countertop, playing the part of a broken man waiting for the end. I asked Gary if I could have a small glass of the wine before I went to bed. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh and grabbed a standard water glass from the drying rack. He poured a careless splash of the priceless vintage into the cheap tumbler and slid it across the stone surface toward me. He told me to drink up because tomorrow was going to be a very big day for the family, and I needed to be well rested for the paperwork. I wrapped my shaking fingers around the glass and brought it to my lips. The wine tasted like ash and bitter memories, but I forced myself to swallow it slowly. I nodded submissively and thanked him for his generosity in my own home. The sheer scale of their hubris was intoxicating to witness. They were celebrating the destruction of my life while sitting in the very house I had just rendered legally untouchable. They strutted around the kitchen, making grandiose plans for their fraudulent wealth, completely unaware that they were already bankrupt. Every smug smile and condescending remark they directed at me only hardened my resolve. I sat quietly absorbing their mockery and cataloging every cruel joke. I was a sponge soaking up their arrogance to fuel the fire of my impending retaliation. They thought they were watching a tired old animal take its final breaths. They did not understand that absolute stillness is the final posture a predator assumes right before the fatal strike. I finished the small amount of wine in my glass and carefully placed the tumbler back onto the granite counter. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and rested my hand over my smartphone. I kept my eyes fixed downward, feigning a state of mental exhaustion, while my thumb expertly navigated the screen by pure muscle memory. My years negotiating ruthless transport contracts under the table had taught me how to communicate without ever showing my hand. I drafted a swift, silent message to Paul at the law firm. I simply typed that the target was arriving tomorrow morning and asked him to confirm the trust was fully armed. The device vibrated once against my palm mere seconds later. Paul replied that the county deed transfer was entirely finalized and the property was legally locked away. The fortress was complete. I then opened a new message thread to contact Carl. Carl was the local county sheriff and a man whose absolute loyalty I had earned 20 years ago when I quietly paid off his daughter's staggering medical debts after a terrible car accident. Carl ran the local law enforcement with an iron fist and a deep respect for the old codes of honor. I sent him a brief, precise text. I told him a hostile party was attempting to execute a fraudulent medical conservatorship at my address tomorrow morning at 9. I asked him to position 2 unmarked deputies at the end of my gravel driveway by 8:30 and to wait for my direct signal before making entry. Carl responded instantly with a single word confirming the operation. The perimeter was now secure. The trap was laid. I had the legal defense perfectly structured and the law enforcement cavalry waiting in the shadows. I was holding every single string in the room, but I kept my hands folded limply in my lap, letting Gary and Linda continue their vile celebration undisturbed. The sharp, piercing chime of a text message echoed through the kitchen. Gary pulled his phone from his pocket and looked at the screen. A massive grin broke across his face as he read the notification from the family group chat. He looked over at Linda and proudly announced that Travis was bringing the notary to the lake house exactly at 9 tomorrow morning to finalize the power of attorney. But then Gary read the second half of the message, and my blood instantly turned to ice. Gary chuckled and said Travis was bringing Megan along to witness the signing so she could feel like she was part of the transition. The mention of my daughter shattered the cold, mechanical detachment I had maintained all evening. Megan was my only child, and the sole remaining piece of my late wife left in this world. She had always been blindingly loyal to Travis, desperate to hold her fractured marriage together, despite his endless financial disasters. Travis was bringing her tomorrow to use her as an emotional human shield. He knew I would never do anything to intentionally hurt my daughter. He planned to force me to sign away my life while looking directly into her eyes, calculating that my love for her would override my instinct for self-preservation. Furthermore, he was deliberately placing her at the scene of the crime to implicate her in his extortion, making her a blind accomplice to the theft of her own inheritance. I felt a terrifying, heavy realization settle over my chest. Tomorrow was no longer just a simple tactical execution of Travis and his parents. It was going to be a delicate and catastrophic surgical extraction. I had to reveal the crushing truth of Travis's federal wire fraud and his absolute betrayal directly to Megan. I had to show my daughter that the man she loved had forged her signature to steal $200,000 and was willing to destroy her father to cover it up. I had to orchestrate the total annihilation of her husband right in front of her without completely destroying her spirit in the process. The stakes had just multiplied infinitely. I slowly stood up from the kitchen stool, wishing them a good night in a weak, trembling voice. I walked down the dark hallway to my bedroom, knowing that tomorrow would be the most violent emotional battle of my entire life. The pale morning light bled through the blinds of my home office, casting long gray shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat perfectly still behind my heavy oak desk, listening to the quiet hum of the house. I had not slept a single minute. My mind was sharp and completely focused on the ticking clock. The trap was armed, and the bait was waiting. Just past 8 o'clock, the crunch of gravel shattered the morning silence. A vehicle approached the house entirely too fast, sliding to a halt near the front porch. Car doors slammed with aggressive force. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden steps. They did not bother to knock or announce their arrival. The front door was shoved open with such violence that the brass handles struck the drywall. I remained seated in my leather chair, keeping my hands folded calmly on the polished wood of my desk. Heavy boots marched directly down the hallway toward my office. Travis burst into the room looking like a wild animal cornered by a pack of wolves. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkled, and his tie was pulled loose. A thick layer of panicked sweat coated his forehead, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot. The anonymous email I sent to his commercial bank had clearly detonated exactly as planned. His accounts were frozen, and he was suffocating under the weight of his own collapsing fraud. Behind him stood a nervous man clutching a black leather briefcase. It was a mobile notary Travis had hired off the books to rubber stamp the theft of my life. But it was the third figure stepping hesitantly into the doorway that made my chest tighten. It was my daughter, Megan. She looked absolutely terrified. Her face was pale and drawn, reflecting weeks of exhaustion and emotional manipulation. Her eyes darted around the room full of manufactured fear and deep confusion. Travis had brought her here as a human shield to emotionally cripple me. He needed her presence to break my resolve and ensure I did not fight back. Travis marched directly up to my desk, completely ignoring any boundaries of respect. He threw the dark blue folder onto the oak surface. The power of attorney documents spilled out across my desk alongside a heavy brass pen. Travis leaned over me, placing his fists on the wood. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with frantic adrenaline. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to sign the paper. He said it was over and I had no choices left. He ordered me to pick up the pen and transfer the medical and financial proxy immediately. He claimed the geriatric doctor was standing by to file the incompetency evaluation with the state if I hesitated for even a second. I did not reach for the pen. I did not look at Travis. I moved my gaze entirely to my daughter standing quietly in the doorway. Megan took a hesitant step forward into the office. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking at me with tears spilling over her eyelashes. Her voice trembled as she spoke. She begged me to just sign the documents. She said it was for my own good and that my mind was failing. She pleaded with me to let Travis take control so I would not get hurt living alone. She told me she just wanted us to be a happy family again, without all this fighting and confusion. Hearing my own child repeat the poisonous lies her husband had fed her was a profound agony. Travis had convinced her that her father was a broken, senile burden who needed to be stripped of his rights for his own safety. He was using her love for me as a weapon against my survival. I wanted to stand up and comfort her. I wanted to tell her that I was perfectly fine and that she had absolutely nothing to fear. But comforting her would only prolong her captivity to a monster. I had to sever her from Travis permanently, and the only way to amputate a rotting limb is with a swift and brutal cut. I kept my hands folded on the desk and looked deeply into my daughter's eyes. I spoke in a clear, calm, and completely steady voice. I asked Megan if she knew that her husband had forged her legal signature on a $200,000 commercial line of credit. The air in the office instantly vanished. Megan stopped crying. She froze completely, her face contorting in pure, absolute confusion. She blinked and took a step back, shaking her head slightly. She looked at me and asked what I was talking about. I did not break eye contact with her. I told her that Travis had lost everything in a fraudulent cryptocurrency mining operation and that he had stolen her identity to secure a massive corporate loan from a commercial bank. I told her the bank had frozen his accounts yesterday afternoon and that he was facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud. I explained that he was trying to steal my lake house today to pay off the forged debt before the bank auditors contacted her to verify the illegal signature. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Megan slowly turned her head to look at her husband. She asked him if what I was saying was true. She asked him if he had forged her name on a loan. Travis completely lost his mind. The carefully constructed facade of the concerned son-in-law instantly evaporated. His skin turned a sickening shade of gray, and the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire conspiracy had just been exposed to the one person he needed to keep in the dark. He spun around and screamed at me to shut my mouth. The volume of his voice echoed off the walls, making the mobile notary physically flinch and take a step backward toward the hallway. Travis ordered Megan not to listen to me. He frantically pointed at my face and shouted that I was crazy. He claimed my dementia was making me hallucinate and invent malicious lies to ruin his marriage. I did not raise my voice or react to his screaming. I maintained my quiet authority. I told Megan that Travis had brought a fake doctor into my house yesterday and offered him $50,000 to write a fraudulent psychological evaluation. I told her I had the entire conversation recorded and safely secured away from this house. I told her Travis was a desperate criminal who was willing to destroy her father and sacrifice her entire future just to save himself from a federal indictment. Megan stared at Travis with wide, horrified eyes. She saw the frantic terror radiating from his body. She saw the sweat dripping down his face and the wild, manic panic in his movements. She did not need to hear the recordings to know I was telling the truth. Travis's violent, defensive outburst confirmed his absolute guilt. He had manipulated her, isolated her, and used her pristine financial record to fund his illegal gambling. The realization washed over her face, replacing her fear with a profound, sickening betrayal. Travis saw the shift in his wife's eyes. He saw the ultimate control slipping through his fingers. His desperation boiled over into pure, primitive rage. He realized he could no longer manipulate his way out of the snare. He had to force compliance through brute strength. Travis let out a furious, guttural roar and lunged completely across the heavy oak desk. He grabbed my right wrist with a crushing, terrifying grip. His fingers dug deeply into my skin, bruising the flesh and twisting my arm down toward the desk surface. He snatched the heavy brass pen with his free hand and tried to physically force the metal barrel into my palm. He leaned his entire body weight over the desk, pinning my arm against the wood. He screamed at me to sign the paper demanding that I give him my house right now. This was the precise moment the conflict permanently escalated beyond the realm of financial fraud. Travis was no longer just an arrogant manipulator trying to steal real estate. He had crossed a massive legal threshold. He was actively committing physical elder assault. He was using violent force against a senior citizen to compel the transfer of property. The mobile notary dropped his leather briefcase onto the floor and backed away in absolute horror, refusing to witness the brutal attack. Megan screamed her husband's name, begging him to stop and let me go. But Travis was entirely deaf to reason. He was a drowning man dragging everyone else underwater with him. He twisted my wrist harder, gritting his teeth, and attempting to drag my hand toward the signature line on the power of attorney. He was sealing his own permanent destruction, and I did not fight back. I let him hold me down, waiting for the cavalry I had stationed at the end of the driveway to finally arrive. Travis believed I was a fragile, decaying old man. He believed that the gray hair on my head and the manufactured slump of my shoulders meant my physical strength had evaporated along with my mind. He had completely forgotten that I spent 30 years of my life working on the freezing coastal docks. I spent decades wrestling heavy steel transport cables, pulling thick wooden pallets, and lifting massive frozen cargo doors before I ever sat behind a corporate desk. The muscles in my arms and the thick bones in my wrists were forged in absolute grueling manual labor. I let Travis hold my arm for exactly 3 agonizing seconds. I wanted Megan to witness the absolute violence residing in her husband's soul. I wanted her to see him bare his teeth and try to break the bones of an old man to satisfy his own pathetic greed. When I saw the horror finally crystallize in my daughter's eyes, I reacted. I did not panic, and I did not struggle wildly. I simply rotated my forearm, dropping my elbow heavily toward the desk and twisting my wrist violently against his thumb joint. The sudden aggressive leverage broke his crushing grip instantly. Travis gasped and stumbled backward, gripping his injured hand against his chest in absolute shock. The sudden shift in physical power mirrored the immediate shift in narrative control. I picked up the heavy brass pen he had tried to force into my palm and calmly dropped it into the metal wastebasket beside my chair. I reached down into my leather briefcase resting on the floor. I pulled out the thick manila envelope I had prepared yesterday afternoon. I tossed it onto the center of the oak desk, right on top of his useless power of attorney document. The heavy slap of the paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. I kept my voice stripped of all emotion, speaking with the cold, mechanical precision of a judge delivering a final, unalterable sentence. I looked directly at Travis and told him to open the envelope. Travis hesitated, his chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. He looked at the manila folder as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. Megan stepped forward, her tear-stained face hardening with a sudden desperate need for the truth. She brushed past her frozen husband and reached out, pulling the flap of the envelope open. She dumped the contents directly across the dark wood of my desk. Travis leaned in, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically across the scattered papers. Gary and Linda had heard the violent shouting from the kitchen and had rushed down the hallway, standing paralyzed just behind Travis in the doorway. The first items to spill out across the desk were the glossy high-definition photographs. They were crystal-clear colored captures taken from the hidden vent camera in my kitchen. The images showed Linda creeping into the room, checking the empty hallway, and deliberately turning the heavy metal dials of the natural gas stove before quickly walking away. There were digital timestamps printed in bright red ink across the bottom margin of every single photo, perfectly matching the exact timeline of their fabricated emergency video. I watched the remaining color completely drain from Linda's face as she stared down at the undeniable photographic proof of her own criminal sabotage. Gary gripped the wooden doorframe, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating horror. Megan pushed the photographs aside with a trembling hand and picked up the thick stack of legal documents bound with a certified Blue County seal. I looked directly at Travis, watching the very last desperate embers of his hope extinguish into ash. I told him he was entirely too late. I explained that exactly 24 hours ago, while he was celebrating his arrogant ultimatum and threatening to lock me in a sterile medical ward, I was sitting in the high-rise office of my corporate attorney. I told him the papers my daughter was currently reading were the finalized, certified, and legally binding documents of an irrevocable trust. I kept my voice extremely low, forcing the 4 of them to hang on to my every single word. I explained that I no longer owned the lake house. The property deed had been completely transferred to the trust yesterday afternoon. The power of attorney document he was demanding I sign was now a completely worthless piece of garbage. I told him that even if he forced my signature today, even if he managed to bribe a dozen fake geriatric doctors to declare me severely incompetent, he could never sell a house that belonged to a protected legal entity. I told Travis he was holding a blank check to a closed bank account, and he would gain absolutely nothing from my estate but mounting legal fees and empty hands. I watched his eyes widen as the absolute finality of my words crushed the remaining breath out of his lungs. But I did not stop there. I pressed the tactical advantage, driving the knife of reality straight into the fragile center of his fraudulent empire. I told Travis that I knew absolutely everything about the $200,000 commercial line of credit he had taken out in Megan's name. I told him I had the crystal-clear digital audio recording of him standing in my living room, explicitly confessing to the wire fraud and the criminal identity theft. I told him that the sudden freeze on his corporate business accounts was not a random security audit. I looked into his terrified eyes and confessed that I was the one who sent the audio file directly to the executive fraud division of his bank yesterday afternoon. Travis collapsed backward until his shoulders hit the drywall of the hallway. His legs seemed to lose all structural integrity. He slid slowly down the wall until he was sitting on the hardwood floor, staring at his empty, trembling hands with a vacant, shattered expression. The realization of his total destruction severed his connection to reality. He had wagered his entire life and freedom on breaking a fragile, isolated old man, and he had just discovered that the old man had orchestrated his complete financial and legal annihilation without ever raising his voice. Gary and Linda realized the massive gravity of their situation with terrifying clarity. Gary grabbed his wife by the arm, whispering frantically that they needed to leave the house immediately before the situation escalated further. They had actively participated in a conspiracy to extort a senior citizen. They had staged a lethal gas leak, manufactured false evidence, and attempted to force the signing of legal documents through psychological intimidation. I looked at Gary as he tried to back out of the doorway. I told him that running would only add fleeing the scene of a federal crime to his long list of impending indictments. I told him the audio files clearly implicated both him and Linda as active accessories to Travis's corporate wire fraud. They were completely trapped inside the burning wreckage of their son's boundless arrogance. Megan dropped the trust documents back onto the desk. She looked down at her husband, sitting pitifully on the floor. She did not kneel beside him. She did not offer him a gentle hand or speak a single word of comfort. The absolute totality of his betrayal had finally shattered the illusion she had been so desperately holding together. He had stolen her identity, ruined her perfect credit, and tried to violently assault her father just to cover up his own pathetic gambling failures. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a profound, devastating sorrow, but also a newfound, piercing clarity. I had forced her to witness the monster without the mask, and while the brutal truth was deeply painful, it was the only thing that could truly set her free. Travis buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sob that echoed through the quiet office. He begged me to call the commercial bank and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded with me to undo the irrevocable trust and just give him the money so he would not go to federal prison. His towering arrogance had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cowardly, sniveling thief begging his victim for unearned mercy. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity or remorse. I told Travis that the time for negotiations had permanently expired the moment he walked into my kitchen and tried to steal the sanctuary my late wife and I had built. I told him that the consequences of absolute greed are never negotiable. At that exact moment, the heavy crunch of thick tires tearing across the gravel driveway echoed loudly through the open windows of the living room. The blinding flash of red and blue emergency lights swept rapidly across the interior walls of my home office, bathing the terrified, pale faces of my enemies in a harsh, pulsing glare. The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut confirmed that Sheriff Carl and his deputies had moved into position. The ultimate consequences had officially arrived at the front door. The heavy knocks echoed through the hallway. They were not polite taps. They were the forceful, rhythmic strikes of law enforcement, demanding immediate entry. Travis froze completely. His fingers loosened around my wrist as the sheer volume of the sound ripped through his blinding rage. He took a stumbling step backward away from my desk. His chest heaved as he stared down the hallway toward the front door. Gary and Linda stood paralyzed in the doorway of my office. They looked like statues carved out of pure terror. The flashing red and blue lights from the driveway painted their pale faces with pulsing colors. I did not move from my chair. I simply rubbed my bruised wrist and waited. The front door swung open. Sheriff Carl stepped into my house. His presence was massive and commanding. His hand rested casually on his utility belt. Two uniformed deputies walked in right behind him, securing the perimeter of the living room with calm professional efficiency. And then Paul stepped through the door. My corporate attorney looked entirely out of place in a rustic lake house. He wore an immaculate tailored suit and carried a pristine leather briefcase. His face was a mask of cold, absolute calculation. He walked down the hallway and stepped into my office, looking at Travis with the detached interest of a scientist observing an insect. Travis tried to speak, but his voice completely failed. He swallowed hard and backed away until he bumped into the bookshelf. Paul did not introduce himself. He did not offer a polite greeting. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He looked directly at Travis and spoke with surgical precision. Paul informed Travis that exactly 1 hour ago, the Executive Fraud Division of his commercial bank had officially filed criminal charges for federal wire fraud and identity theft. Paul stated that the anonymous tip provided to the bank had been thoroughly verified. The bank auditors had matched the digital signature on the $200,000 line of credit against Megan's historical financial records. The forgery was undeniable. Travis began to shake. His knees visibly trembled beneath his tailored trousers. He looked at Megan, but she refused to meet his gaze. She stood quietly in the corner, wrapping her arms tightly around her chest. Paul continued his relentless verbal assault. He told Travis that the bank had already contacted the federal authorities and the local district attorney. Warrants for his arrest regarding the financial theft were currently being drafted by a judge. The power of attorney document lying on my desk was not just worthless. It was now physical evidence of an ongoing extortion plot designed to cover up a federal crime. Paul looked at Travis and delivered the final fatal blow. He told him his accounts were frozen, his assets were seized, and his freedom was officially over. Sheriff Carl stepped forward, filling the space Paul had just vacated. Carl did not wear a suit, but his authority was absolute. He looked at my bruised wrist and then looked at Travis. I reached across my desk and turned my laptop monitor toward the sheriff. I tapped the keyboard to play the video files I had transferred from the hidden cameras. I told Carl that the first video was captured just yesterday afternoon in my kitchen. Carl leaned over the desk and watched the high-definition footage. The screen clearly showed Linda creeping into the room, checking the empty hallway, and deliberately turning the heavy metal dials of the natural gas stove. The hiss of the gas was perfectly audible on the recording. Linda let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands and backed into Gary. Gary looked like he was going to be physically sick. Sheriff Carl watched the screen as Linda hurried out of the kitchen, leaving the lethal gas flowing into the closed house. Carl stood up straight and looked directly at Linda. He told her she was looking at a felony charge for reckless endangerment and manufacturing false evidence. He stated that staging a lethal hazard to extort an elderly man was one of the most despicable things he had ever seen in his 20 years of law enforcement. I tapped the keyboard again. I told Carl that I had installed a secondary security camera right here in my home office. I played the footage captured just 3 minutes ago. The video showed Travis screaming at me across the desk. It captured the exact moment his facade completely shattered. The high-definition audio played Travis shouting that I was crazy and inventing malicious lies. Then the video showed Travis violently lunging across the desk. It showed him grabbing my wrist with brutal force, trying to physically compel me to sign the fraudulent documents. It was irrefutable high-definition proof of physical elder assault. The panic inside the room became absolute. Travis realized that he was completely trapped. He was facing federal prison for wire fraud and state prison for assaulting a senior citizen. The walls were closing in, and his survival instinct overrode every single ounce of his remaining loyalty. He turned toward the doorway and pointed a trembling finger directly at his own parents. Travis screamed that it was not his fault. He shouted that staging the gas leak was entirely Gary and Linda's idea. He claimed they were the ones who wanted to steal the lake house and flip the property for a massive profit. He desperately tried to paint himself as an innocent bystander who was just trying to help his parents secure their retirement. Gary erupted in pure, furious rage. The fragile alliance between the predators shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces. Gary lunged forward, shoving Travis hard in the chest. He screamed that Travis was a pathetic liar and a failure. Gary shouted that Travis had forged the bank loan all by himself and lost the money on stupid digital investments. He told the sheriff that Travis had begged them to come to the lake house and help him create a distraction so he could steal my estate before the federal auditors found him. Gary threw his own son completely under the bus, desperately trying to save his own skin. Linda began to sob hysterically. She sank to the floor crying that she did not want to go to jail. She pointed at Travis and screamed that he had forced them to do it. She claimed Travis had threatened to cut them off entirely if they did not help him fake the psychological evaluation. They were turning on each other like starving animals, fighting over a scrap of meat. The loyalty they had, so proudly displayed yesterday, was completely non-existent. They had no honor and no love for one another. They were just greedy cowards who were willing to destroy anyone, including their own family, to escape the consequences of their actions. Megan stood in the corner watching her husband and his parents tear each other apart. She did not cry. She did not yell. The terrifying reality of the family she had married into was playing out right in front of her eyes. She saw the absolute lack of morality and the desperate, selfish panic. Travis looked at her, begging her to tell the sheriff that he was a good man. He pleaded with her to defend him. Megan just stared at him with cold, empty eyes. She quietly told him that she was contacting a divorce attorney this afternoon, and she never wanted to see his face again. She turned her back on him and walked out of the office, stepping past the deputies and walking out the front door into the cool morning air. Sheriff Carl had heard enough. He signaled to his deputies. The two uniformed officers stepped into the office and grabbed Gary and Linda by the arms, lifting them off the floor and guiding them out to the squad cars. Carl pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He walked around my desk and grabbed Travis by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the bookshelf. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting closed around Travis's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had heard in weeks. Carl recited the Miranda rights in a deep, steady voice. He informed Travis that he was under arrest for physical elder assault, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He told him the federal authorities would be waiting for him at the county jail to add the wire fraud and identity theft charges to his booking sheet. Travis did not fight back. He went completely limp. The remaining arrogance drained out of his body, leaving behind nothing but a broken, empty shell of a man. His entire world had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. Carl pulled Travis away from the bookshelf and marched him down the hallway. The house was suddenly filled with the heavy silence of a passing storm. Paul remained in the office, quietly packing his documents back into his pristine leather briefcase. He snapped the latches shut and gave me a single respectful nod before turning and walking out the door. I sat alone at my heavy oak desk. I looked down at the blue folder and the scattered photographs of my enemies digging their own graves. The trap had sprung with absolute perfection. I had not yelled, and I had not thrown a single punch. I had simply used their own towering greed to build a cage they could never escape. I took a deep breath of the quiet morning air, feeling the profound, heavy peace of total victory. I turned my attention away from the hallway where Travis was being marched out in steel handcuffs. My gaze shifted to the corner of the office where Gary and Linda stood huddled together like frightened mice. The towering arrogance they had displayed less than 12 hours ago when they were drinking my vintage wine and planning the demolition of my living room was completely gone. Linda was trembling so violently that her teeth were chattering. Gary had his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. I walked slowly around the edge of my oak desk and stopped just 3 feet in front of them. I spoke with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who held their entire future in the palm of his hand. I told them they had exactly 30 minutes to collect their belongings and vacate my property. I made it explicitly clear that if I saw their faces inside my house on the 31st minute, Sheriff Carl would place them under immediate arrest for criminal trespassing and elder endangerment. Carl stepped up right behind my shoulder, resting his hand on his utility belt to reinforce the promise. He leaned forward and told Gary that the county jail had plenty of empty cells waiting for them if they wanted to test my patience. The threat landed like a physical blow. Gary and Linda did not attempt to argue or negotiate or beg for mercy. The sheer reality of their legal exposure had terrified them into absolute compliance. They scrambled out of the office, tripping over each other in their desperate haste to reach the guest wing. I followed them down the hallway, standing in the threshold of the bedroom to supervise their frantic evacuation. They did not carefully fold their expensive clothes or pack their designer luggage with care. Gary ripped black plastic garbage bags from a roll he found in the kitchen and began stuffing shirts, pants, and shoes indiscriminately into the plastic. Linda was sobbing hysterically, blindly, grabbing her cosmetics and throwing them into her purse. It was a pathetic, undignified retreat. They had arrived at my home acting like conquering royalty, ready to claim an unearned inheritance, but they were leaving like common thieves running from a burning building. I watched their humiliating scramble without a single ounce of sympathy. They had tried to lock me in a sterile medical facility to steal my life, and now they were being thrown out into the cold morning air with nothing but garbage bags. While Gary and Linda frantically emptied the guest wing, I walked back toward the front entrance. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers continued to wash across the gravel driveway. Megan was standing on the front porch, wrapped in her heavy coat, watching as deputy officers forced Travis into the back of a patrol car. Travis tried to call out to her one last time, pleading for her to help him, but the heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic cries. Megan did not move. She stood perfectly still, watching the cruiser tires crunch against the gravel as it pulled away, carrying the man she had loved to a federal holding cell. I stepped out onto the porch and stood quietly beside her. For a long time, we simply listened to the fading sound of the police sirens echoing through the dense pine trees. Then the shock finally wore off, and the crushing weight of reality settled onto her shoulders. Megan buried her face in her hands and broke down into violent, racking sobs. She turned to me, collapsing against my chest. I wrapped my arms securely around her, holding her tight, just as I had done when she was a little girl waking up from a terrible nightmare. She apologized over and over again, her voice muffled against my jacket. She cried that she had been so incredibly blind to his manipulation. She begged for my forgiveness for believing the horrible lies Travis had told her about my mental decline, and for almost letting him destroy my life. I rested my hand on the back of her head and told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I spoke with a gentle but firm reassurance, making sure she understood every single word. I told her that Travis was a master manipulator who preyed on her loyalty and weaponized her love to cover his own criminal failures. I explained that she was a victim of his fraud just as much as I was. He had isolated her and twisted her reality to serve his own greed. I pulled back slightly, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. I told her the nightmare was officially over, but she had to act with immediate strategic precision to protect her own future. I offered her the entire guest wing of the lake house. I told her she could stay with me for as long as she needed to rebuild her life. I also gave her strict, immediate instructions. I told her the very first thing she had to do today was contact the major credit bureaus and place an absolute freeze on her Social Security number to prevent Travis from opening any more fraudulent accounts. Then I told her she needed to hire the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city to legally sever herself from his impending federal convictions. I offered to cover all of her legal fees to ensure she was completely insulated from the financial fallout of his crimes. Megan nodded, wiping the tears from her cheeks. She took a deep breath, pulling herself together with a newfound resilience. The manipulation was broken, and she was finally seeing the world clearly. The heavy sound of a diesel engine revving interrupted our conversation on the porch. Gary and Linda had finished loading their rented moving truck. They threw their final black garbage bags into the back of the vehicle and slammed the cargo door shut. They did not come back to the porch to say goodbye to Megan. They did not offer any apologies or attempt to make amends for their part in the conspiracy. Their only concern was escaping the jurisdiction of Sheriff Carl before the district attorney decided to press accessory charges. Gary climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door with frantic urgency. Linda hid her face behind her hands in the passenger seat, completely humiliated by the absolute failure of their grand extortion plot. The moving truck peeled out of my driveway, its heavy tires spinning and kicking up a massive cloud of white gravel. I stood on the porch with my arm around my daughter, watching the truck speed down the old logging road until it disappeared completely around the bend. The cloud of dust slowly settled back onto the driveway, taking the last remaining trace of their toxic presence with it. Sheriff Carl walked down the wooden steps and paused at the bottom of the porch. He tipped his hat to Megan, offering her a sympathetic nod, before turning his attention to me. He told me he would personally handle the booking process for Travis and ensure the federal investigators received the encrypted flash drive containing the audio confessions and the trail camera footage. He warned me that there would be sworn statements and legal depositions in the coming weeks, but the physical threat to my safety was permanently neutralized. I shook his hand, thanking him for his flawless timing and his unwavering loyalty. Paul stepped out of the house right behind the sheriff, his pristine leather briefcase gripped firmly in his hand. My longtime corporate attorney adjusted his suit jacket and looked out at the peaceful lake. He did not smile, but there was a deep satisfaction in his sharp gray eyes. He had successfully orchestrated the total legal defense of my estate and engineered the immediate downfall of a criminal predator. Paul told me the irrevocable trust was ironclad, and my assets were permanently shielded from any future attacks. He promised to coordinate with the new divorce attorney to ensure Travis could not claim a single dime of her inheritance during the separation proceedings. Paul shook my hand, walked to his luxury sedan, and drove away quietly, following the police cruiser down the long, winding road. I was finally left entirely alone with my daughter. The chaotic, violent storm that had invaded my home had been completely eradicated. I walked through the quiet house, heading straight for the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of black coffee. The counterfeit remodeling plans and the arrogant threats were gone, leaving only the comforting familiarity of my true home. I poured a steaming mug of coffee and walked out onto the back deck. I leaned against the wooden railing, feeling the cool, crisp breeze drifting off the surface of the bay. The sun was rising higher in the sky, burning away the morning fog and illuminating the dark water with brilliant light. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. The natural order had been entirely restored. The suffocating weight of the extortion was gone. The absolute unbroken silence of the lake house returned, wrapping around me like a protective shield. If there is one profound lesson to be drawn from this entire ordeal, it is that true strength does not always roar in the face of betrayal. Sometimes the most devastating defense is absolute silence and infinite patience. Greed blinds people to reality, convincing them that kindness is weakness and age is a vulnerability to be exploited. But when you refuse to surrender your dignity and instead use your intellect to build an impenetrable fortress, you strip the predators of their only weapon. Family is defined by mutual respect and unwavering loyalty, not by entitlement and manipulation. If you found value in this story of reclaiming peace and outsmarting those who seek to destroy you, please share your thoughts in the comments below.